Hey there. Yes, you tucked in somewhere warm and quiet right now. Thank you for choosing to spend these next few minutes with me instead of one more scroll through your phone. I know exactly how tempting that other option is. Tonight we're doing something a little different, so settle in because where this story takes us is further back than almost anything I have shared with you before. Somewhere in a quiet stretch of Germany, buried under layers of soft wet clay for longer than either of us could really picture, someone left behind 10 wooden spears and the bones of more than 10 horses. For decades, most scientists believed the people who made those spears were too simple, too clumsy to actually hunt anything at all. Then, in 2025, a small snail shell quietly rewrote everything we thought we knew about who we really are. Before we step into that, if stories like this one bring you any comfort, a like on this video and a tap on that subscribe button would mean more than you might think. It is a small thing on your end, but it tells me you would like more nights like this one. And if you leave a comment, I always look through every single one, so tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Or just say hello, I would love that. Now, if you can turn the lights down low around you, maybe switch on a fan or anything with a soft, steady hum, and let's slip into tonight's story together. Picture a lake, calm silver resting under a sky that has not changed all that much in all the ages since. The air smells like wet earth and green reeds. Somewhere nearby, smoke curls up from a small fire, and around it move people we might not fully recognize if we passed them on the street. And yet in every way that matters, they were a family. A mother crouches near the fire, turning a piece of wood over and over in her hands, testing its weight. Nearby, a child copies her holding a smaller stick, the exact same way, because that is how learning has always worked long before there was ever a word for school. Somewhere past the tall grass, a herd of wild horses moves along the water's edge, unaware that a group of hunters is already talking quietly among themselves, working out a plan. This is not the version of the deep past most of us grew up picturing. There is no lone caveman dragging a club, grunting his way through life. This is teamwork. This is patience. This is people who cared enough about the ones beside them to teach, to plan, to protect. A horse is not a small animal, and it is not a slow one either. Bringing one down takes more than a single spear and a bit of courage. It takes hunters who understand exactly where the herd will drink, which direction the animals will bolt if startled, and how soft, muddy ground near the water's edge can slow a horse down just enough to matter. Someone has to signal the others without a sound. Someone has to hold their nerve while a frightened, powerful animal is only a few steps away. And afterward there is no freezer waiting at home, no way to save the meat for later, which means the entire group has to move fast, working together late into the night, so that nothing from that kill goes to waste. Every hand matters. Every person, young or old, has a part to play. Now let's leave that fireside for just a moment and step into the present, because this is where the story gets its proof. In 1994, in an open-pit coal mine near a small German town called Schoningen, workers were digging through the earth when they started pulling up something nobody expected. Long, smooth pieces of wood shaped with a purpose that was impossible to miss. Over the next 5 years, an archaeologist named Hartmut Thiem and his team carefully lifted 10 wooden spears out of that clay along with a lance and several sharpened double-pointed sticks. Wrapped around them were the bones of more than 10 horses, some marked in ways that only careful butchery could leave behind. Here is the part that still gives me a little shiver every time I think about it. Wood almost never survives that long. Bones can turn to stone. Stone tools can outlast entire civilizations, but wood rots, breaks down, disappears within a few hundred years under normal conditions. The only reason these spears made it to us at all is because the clay around that ancient lake sealed them away from air, keeping them wet, keeping them whole, like a message tucked into a bottle, and thrown into the deepest kind of silence, one that lasted longer than our entire species has existed as we know it now. When researchers studied the wood closely, what they found was not rough or careless work. Each spear had been shaped from a carefully chosen spruce or pine tree, scraped smooth, seasoned, and balanced so precisely that modern athletes who have thrown replicas say they handle almost like a javelin you would find on an Olympic field today. Someone even noticed that a few of the spears were smaller, lighter sized for hands that had not fully grown yet, which suggests something rather touching if you sit with it for a moment. Children may have been given their own versions to practice with the exact same way a parent today might hand a child a smaller version of a tool so they can learn beside the people they love instead of just watching from a distance. A closer study of the wood published in 2024 went even further than anyone expected. Using three-dimensional microscopes and small scanners similar to the ones a hospital might use, a team led by researcher Dirk Lieder found something almost impossible to imagine from people we once called simple. Whoever shaped these spears knew how to split a single log cleanly into smaller, straighter pieces, choosing exactly the right point on the trunk to work with the grain instead of fighting against it. And when a tool broke or a tip dulled from use, they did not throw it away. They sat right there on the spot and fixed it the same instinct any of us might have today when a favourite pair of shoes wears thin and we would rather patch them up than start over from nothing. Nor was Schoningen the only place this story showed up. Back in 1911, in a town called Clacton-on-Sea in England, someone found the sharpened tip of a yew wood spear, roughly the same age, quietly resting in the ground for just as long. And near the town of Boxgrove, also in England, archaeologists uncovered something even harder to explain away. The shoulder blade of an ancient rhinoceros, dated to around 500,000 years old, carrying a wound that could only have come from a weapon thrown with real force from a real distance by someone who meant to hit exactly where they aimed. One discovery might have been a strange exception. 3 spread across different corners of Europe start to look a great deal like a pattern. For years, the accepted age of these spears sat somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years, which placed them long before our own species Homo sapiens had even fully appeared. That number mattered so much because up until this discovery, plenty of respected scientists believed early humans of that period were mostly scavengers, wandering the land, picking over what predators had left behind, too limited to plan, too disorganized to hunt large, dangerous animals on purpose. It is a small detail on the surface, but underneath it changes the entire story we tell ourselves about where we come from. A scavenger simply survives whatever the day happens to bring. A hunter looks ahead, imagines what comes next, and prepares for it. 10 wooden spears found beside more than 10 butchered horses quietly told a very different story. But history, it turns out, is never quite finished asking questions of itself. In the year 2025, an international team of scientists returned to that same soil, armed with a method most of us have never heard of, something called amino acid geochronology. Instead of guessing an age from the layers of rock and sediment around the spears, they studied tiny amino acids locked inside ancient snail shells buried in that exact same ground. Snails, it turns out, are surprisingly reliable little historians, and what they revealed was a full 100,000 years younger than everyone had believed. These spears were closer to 200,000 years old. That single correction changed who gets credit for making them. Instead of belonging to an earlier human ancestor, these tools were most likely shaped by the hands of Neanderthals. If the word Neanderthal brings up an image in your mind of a stooped, grunting figure dragging his feet through a cold cave somewhere you are far from alone, that picture has been sitting in popular culture for over a century, and honestly it might be one of the most stubborn misunderstandings in all of human history. Because what these spears actually prove is a group of people organized enough to plan an ambush on fast, powerful animals, near open water, skilled enough to shape and repair their own weapons on sight, and bonded tightly enough as a community to raise their children inside that same tradition, generation after generation. That takes talking to each other. That takes trust. That takes someone remembering how their own parent once taught them and choosing to pass it forward instead of letting it disappear. I like to imagine the arguments that must have happened around that fire too. Someone insisting spruce holds an edge better than pine. Someone else certain the opposite is true, both of them equally stubborn about it. Some disagreements, it turns out, are simply older than recorded history itself, and if you have ever tried to win an argument with a relative who refuses to change their mind, congratulations, you now share something in common with people who lived 200,000 years before you did. What moves me most about Shoningen is not really the wood or the horse bones or even the clever new dating method. It is what all of it adds up to. Long before writing, long before cities, long before anything we would call civilization, someone stood beside a quiet lake and made something meant to last. A tool shaped with care, taught to a child with patience, aimed at keeping the people they loved fed and safe through one more season. That instinct to plan ahead to teach the next generation to take care of each other did not begin with us. It was already old by the time modern humans even arrived on the scene. We tend to think of the deep past as cold and far away, something separate from us, almost like an entirely different species lived out those days. But a mother teaching her child how to hold a spear correctly is not so different from a mother's day teaching her child how to ride a bike or how to be brave on the first day of school. The tools change. The love underneath them somehow never does. Every so often when I sit with a story like this one, I find myself wondering what those hunters would make of us now. Warm homes, running water food, arriving at our door within the hour if we simply ask for it. I like to think they would not be jealous of any of that. I think they would just be quietly glad to know that all that planning by the fire, all that patience teaching a child to hold a spear correctly, never really stopped mattering. It just changed shape. We still teach our children how to survive the world around them. We still gather around something warm at the end of a hard day. 200,000 years is a long time, and somehow it is not long enough to change the parts of us that matter most. And that spear, no matter how carefully it was made, was only ever half the story. Because long before anyone shaped a single piece of wood into a weapon, our very first tool for hunting was not made of anything at all. It was simply our own two legs, and in one of the hottest, driest deserts left on our earth, there are hunters alive today who still remember exactly how to use them. In the early 1990s, a South African scientist named Louis Liebenberg found himself standing in the blistering heat of the Kalahari Desert, being told quite firmly to turn back and return to camp. The hunters he'd been following were worried he might not survive what was about to happen next. He insisted on continuing anyway, a decision that very nearly cost him his life, though not for any of the reasons you might expect. No predator was stalking him. No venomous snake was coiled nearby in the sand. He was about to witness and clumsily try to keep pace with one of the oldest hunting methods our species has ever developed, one that requires no spear, no bow and arrow, no blade of any kind. Just two legs, a merciless sun, and a stubbornness that borders on the unreasonable. The temperature that particular day had already climbed well past what most of us would consider safe for any real physical exertion, let alone hour after hour of it. Liebenberg was 30 years old, reasonably fit by the standards most of us would use to judge ourselves, dressed sensibly for the heat, except for a pair of heavy leather boots he had chosen deliberately as protection against the venomous snakes known to hide in that particular stretch of desert. It seemed like a wise precaution at the time. By midday, soaked through with sweat and struggling simply to keep the hunters in sight, He was beginning to understand exactly why they had tried so hard to send him back. We are in the Kalahari now, a vast dry stretch of southern Africa, spreading across parts of what we know today as Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, home to the San people sometimes called the Bushmen, among the oldest continuous cultures anywhere on this earth. And the hunting method Liebenberg had travelled so far to witness is called persistence hunting, which is, if you ask me, a rather modest name for something this remarkable. The idea is almost embarrassingly simple to describe, and nearly impossible for most of us to actually carry out. You choose an animal, you start running after it, and you do not stop, not for hours, not through the hottest part of the day, until the animal itself simply cannot run anymore. Would you have guessed that one of humanity's oldest and most effective hunting weapons was never a weapon at all, but rather the simple, stubborn refusal to quit? Here is where the science becomes remarkably fascinating, and I promise this will make sense in a way that connects directly back to your own body. Picture a kudu, a large, powerful antelope capable of extraordinary bursts of speed, easily fast enough to leave any human sprinting after it in the dust within the first few seconds. Over a short distance there is no contest whatsoever. But a kudu, like nearly every four-legged animal built for speed, cools itself primarily through panting, which means at some point running at full effort in blistering heat, it has to slow down, find shade and breathe. A human being, strange as this sounds, does not share that particular limitation nearly as severely. We are covered in millions of sweat glands. Rather than a heavy coat of fur, we walk upright on 2 legs rather than 4, and that combination lets us shed heat continuously, even while still moving forward at a steady pace. Over a short sprint, the kudu wins easily every single time. Over several relentless hours in open sun-scorched country, the advantage flips entirely, and it flips in our favour. Scientists studying human evolution now believe this exact advantage. Our unusual talent for endurance running may have shaped the human body itself. Long springy legs, an efficient upright stride, and that dense network of sweat glands, all pointing toward the same conclusion, that somewhere far back in our history, outrunning dangerous, powerful animals over long distances was not just possible for us. It may have been one of the very traits that made us who we are, physically sculpted slowly across an almost unthinkable stretch of time, possibly stretching back nearly 2 million years, which would place this method even further back than that quiet lakeside spear we spent our first story together getting to know so closely. A widely cited study published in the journal Nature back in 2004 laid out this exact argument in careful detail, examining everything from the springiness of the human Achilles tendon to the particular shape of our skulls, and concluded that our bodies show clear, consistent signs of having been shaped by selective pressure toward exactly this kind of extended, heat-tolerant running. Reading through research like that, it becomes difficult to keep thinking of the human body as some kind of accident cobbled together for no particular reason. There is a strong argument to be made that we were built quite deliberately by the slow hand of evolution to be extraordinary distance runners first, long before we were ever particularly good at anything else on this earth. Let that sit with you for a moment. Long before anyone ever shaped a spear or strung a bow and arrow, our very first true hunting weapon may simply have been endurance itself, built directly into muscle, lungs and skin, requiring no tool at all beyond the body a person was already born into. So what does an actual persistence hunt look like, practically speaking? It rarely involves a dramatic all-out sprint the way you might picture from a nature documentary. Hunters trot more than sprint, moving at a pace that feels almost restrained. Tracking their target patiently across sand and scrub, under a sun that in the Kalahari regularly climbs past 40 degrees Celsius. Every time the animal manages to put real distance between itself and its pursuers, the hunters simply keep coming steady, unhurried, refusing to let it settle into shade long enough to properly cool down. Slowly over the course of 2 hours, sometimes 3 or 4, exhaustion begins to show itself in small, precise details. Only an experienced eye would ever catch a shortening stride, sand kicked up more heavily with each step, a path that starts wandering rather than running in a clean, deliberate line. Noticing those small details is its own entire skill, every bit as demanding as the running itself. Sand trackers can look at a print pressed into sand or dust and tell you with real confidence roughly how long ago the animal passed which direction it was heading, and even something about its physical condition in that exact moment. It is a kind of literacy most of us have never had reason to develop, studying the ground itself the way you or I might study a paragraph of familiar text, except every single letter is written in shifting sand, and it has usually already begun fading before you even arrive to study it. A deep, unhurried print with sharp, clean edges tells a tracker the animal was still moving comfortably well within itself, not yet troubled by the heat. A print that grows shallower, messier, dragged slightly at the edges rather than planted firmly, tells an entirely different story, one of a body starting to strain muscles no longer firing quite as cleanly as they were an hour earlier. Trackers can apparently even judge from the spacing between prints whether an animal's stride has begun shortening, the surest sign that exhaustion has finally started winning the argument against instinct. None of this comes from a manual. It comes from a lifetime spent walking the same stretch of desert, watching the same animals generation after generation, until the ground itself starts speaking in a language only patient, careful attention can properly translate. Can you imagine reading that much meaning into a single footprint? One you or I would likely walk straight past without a second glance. Picture the chase itself for a moment, because I think the rhythm of it matters more than the raw distance covered. There is no sprinting involved, not really, not for long stretches at a time. Hunters settle into something closer to a steady, almost meditative trot, conserving energy with every stride because the entire strategy depends on outlasting the animal rather than outrunning it in any single burst. Every so often the kudu bolts distance, opening up fast between hunter and prey, and every single time the hunters simply keep coming at that same unhurried pace, patient, certain that the gap will shrink again soon enough on its own. It always does. An animal running flat out in extreme heat burns through its own reserves far faster than a human moving at a measured, sustainable pace ever will. Slowly, painfully, across hour after hour, that basic arithmetic starts working entirely in the hunter's favour. There is a mental side to this that I think deserves just as much attention as the physical one, maybe more. Somewhere around the second or third hour, with the body screaming every reasonable argument it can muster for simply stopping something else, has to take over a kind of quiet, practiced discipline that refuses to negotiate with exhaustion. Hunters who have described this experience often talk about entering a strange, almost meditative headspace. During the longest stretches, thoughts narrowing down to nothing but the next print in the sand, the next steady breath, the next small sign that the animal ahead is finally beginning to falter. It is not blind stubbornness. It is something closer to trust. Trust built over a lifetime that the body will keep answering the call for just a little while longer, even when every immediate signal insists otherwise. Now back to Liebenberg, because I think his story deserves a proper ending rather than being left hanging the way I left it a few minutes ago. Despite every warning, he pushed forward alongside the hunters that day, trying and largely failing to match their pace across hour after hour of open, superheated country. The kudu they were tracking grew visibly more exhausted as the chase wore on its tracks, betraying the same signs the hunters had spent a lifetime learning to notice. Liebenberg, meanwhile, was not faring nearly so well. He had not trained for this the way his companions had across entire lifetimes spent moving through this exact landscape, and the heat very nearly finished him before it ever finished the animal they were chasing. He survived, obviously, since he lived to write about it afterward, but by his own account it was a far closer call than he had expected walking into that morning. I find something worth sitting with in that particular detail, if I am honest with you. A scientist trained, prepared, and reasonably fit by most modern standards came shockingly near to being defeated by an ordeal that sand hunters of that same community complete successfully and somewhat routinely as simply part of feeding their families. That gap between them was never really about raw physical strength. It was about a depth of practiced endurance, environmental knowledge, and sheer accumulated experience that no amount of modern fitness training can fully substitute for on its own. Here is a connection I think you will enjoy, especially if you have ever laced up a pair of running shoes yourself. That same endurance advantage scientists point to when explaining persistence, hunting is very likely the same underlying biology that makes humans of every animal on this earth remarkably well suited to long-distance running as a sport. Marathon runners, ultra-distance athletes, pushing through 50 or 100 miles at a stretch, every one of them is quietly drawing on the exact same physiology that once let a hunter in the Kalahari outlast a kudu under a punishing midday sun. The tools have changed entirely. Cushioned shoes, sports drinks marked courses instead of open desert, but the underlying machinery carrying a person across that distance has not changed even slightly. Have you ever pushed through a run or a long walk or honestly any physical task well past the point where your body first started begging you to stop, only to discover there was quite a bit more left in the tank than you originally believed? That particular feeling, the one where your legs keep moving almost independently of your own doubts, is not some modern invention born from motivational posters and fitness apps. It is ancient. It is quite literally the exact same biological stubbornness that once fed entire families in one of the harshest environments on our Earth. There is a real elegance in that continuity, I think. Somewhere in nearly all of us, tucked away beneath schedules and screens and comfortable climate-controlled rooms, there is still a body built for exactly this, built to keep moving steadily forward long after most other creatures would have already stopped. Most of us will never actually need to call on that particular inheritance the way a Kalahari hunter still does. But it is there all the same, quietly waiting, whether we ever choose to use it or not. There is something almost humbling about closing our eyes tonight knowing that, and I mean that quite sincerely. For all the tools, all the technology, all the comfort separating our world from the one Liebenberg briefly stumbled into that scorching afternoon, the body carrying you through your own days right now is still underneath everything. The exact same patient, stubborn machine that once ran a kudu into the ground under an unforgiving desert sun. Even the most extraordinary human body has its limits, though, and there would come a moment in our long story tonight when someone somewhere looked down at their own throwing arm and wondered whether it could be made to do something it was never quite built to do entirely on its own. Let's stay with that thought for a moment, because it turns out someone actually answered that question tens of thousands of years before any of us were born, and the solution they landed on is so simple that you have probably already used a modern version of it yourself without ever realizing what you are holding. If you have a dog and you've ever used one of those plastic ball throwing sticks, a small scoop on the end of a rigid handle, to send a tennis ball sailing across a park far beyond anything your own arm could manage alone, you already understand the exact mechanical idea we're about to explore. Ice Age hunters figured out that same trick using nothing but a carved piece of wood or antler, and it changed what a single human being was capable of doing with a simple throw forever. The tool is called an atlatl, sometimes known as a spear thrower, and if that name sounds unfamiliar, the concept behind it will not stay unfamiliar for long. Picture a narrow length of wood roughly the size of a large kitchen knife, with a small hook or socket carved into one end. A hunter rests the base of a light spear, usually called a dart, against that hook, holds the far end of the atlatl in hand, and throws not with the spear alone, but with the entire length of the tool, acting as an extension of the arm itself. The dart releases from the very tip of the atlatl rather than directly from the hand, and that small difference in distance changes absolutely everything about how fast and how far it travels. Would you have guessed that a simple stick with a hook on one end could turn an ordinary human throw into something closer to a small piece of artillery? Here is the actual physics behind it, and I promise it is more intuitive than it sounds. When you throw something with your bare hand, your arm acts as a lever, but a fairly short one pivoting mostly from the shoulder and elbow. An atlatl extends that same lever considerably, adding real length between the pivot point at your shoulder and the point where the dart finally releases. A longer lever moving through the same arc in the same amount of time means the very tip of that lever, the point where your dart lets go, is travelling dramatically faster than your hand alone ever could. It is the exact same principle behind cracking a whip, where the tip moves faster than the hand holding it, or behind that plastic ball thrower flinging a tennis ball halfway across a park while your own arm barely seems to move at all. Nothing about human strength changed. The geometry changed, and that alone was enough to turn an ordinary hunter into something far more dangerous. Think about a garden hose for a moment coiled loosely on the ground, and picture flicking just one end of it. The far end whips through the air with a speed and force completely out of proportion to the small motion your wrist actually made. That is not magic. That is simply what happens when energy travels down an extended length and has nowhere else to go but outward, gathering speed the further it moves from the point where it started. Ice Age hunters never had a word for kinetic energy, and they certainly never sat through a physics lecture explaining any of this. But they clearly understood the result well enough to carve it into a tool, refine it across generations, and hand it down to their own children as a working, dependable piece of technology. Modern testing with faithful replicas backs up exactly what these hunters must have felt firsthand every single time they threw one. Depending on the design and the skill of the thrower, an atlatl dart can leave the thrower's hand at speeds rivaling a thrown baseball and travel considerably farther and with considerably more punch than any bare-handed throw could manage. Against an animal the size of a deer, or something far larger, that difference is not a small improvement. It is the difference between a hunt that ends in real food for a family and one that ends with an animal simply walking away unharmed, disappearing back into the tall grass. I find something rather wonderful in that, if I am honest with you. This was not a discovery that required new muscles, new courage, or some dramatic leap in raw physical ability. It required noticing patiently and cleverly that a longer stick moving through the same motion could do something a shorter one your own arm simply could not. We do not know exactly who first carved a piece of wood into this shape, or exactly where they were standing when the idea first came together in their mind, but we do know quite a bit about where the evidence eventually turns up. Some of the oldest confirmed atlatls we have found come from Ice Age Europe, particularly sites scattered across what is now France and Spain, dating back roughly 17,000 years to a period archaeologists call the Magdalenian. Many of these surviving hooks were carved from ivory or reindeer antler rather than plain wood, since those denser materials preserve far longer buried in the ground, and quite a few of them were shaped with real artistry, decorated with the carved forms of animals. These same hunters would have known intimately leaping horses, ibex balanced mid-stride creatures captured in a kind of frozen motion on a tool meant to launch something else entirely through the air. Picture that combination for a moment, because I think it deserves to be sat with a little. This was at its core purely functional equipment built to help feed a family through a brutal Ice Age winter, and yet someone still took the time to carve it beautifully to turn a hunting tool into something worth admiring, even when nobody's life depended on how it looked. That instinct to make even our most practical objects a little bit beautiful apparently goes back considerably further than most of us would ever have guessed. A tool like that would have taken real hours away from hunting gathering, or simply resting hours spent instead on decoration that did nothing whatsoever to improve how far or how hard the dart would fly. Whoever carved it clearly believed that mattered anyway. The Atlatl story does not stay confined to Europe either. Thousands of years later, and an entire ocean away, hunters across the Americas were relying on this exact same tool to bring down animals almost too large to properly imagine standing beside today: woolly mammoths, mastodons, creatures that dwarf the largest land animals left on our Earth now. Archaeologists studying sites tied to what is known as the Clovis culture, spread across North America roughly 13,000 years ago, have recovered large, finely worked stone points that were mounted not on simple hand-thrown spears, but on Atlatl darts, meaning an entire continent of hunters had independently arrived at or carried forward this same fundamental idea, extending the human arm just enough to make the impossible merely difficult instead. Picture what that hunt must have actually required for a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with the sheer nerve involved. A mammoth could stand well over 10 feet at the shoulder, weighing many times more than the largest animal any of us are ever likely to encounter face to face. No single dart, no matter how well aimed, was ever going to drop an animal that size outright. Hunters almost certainly worked in coordinated groups, aiming for the same vulnerable areas again and again, wearing the animal down across repeated strikes. Patient in a way that echoes something we have already spent real time with earlier tonight, willing to commit to a struggle that might stretch on for hours rather than seconds. The Atlatl gave them the reach and the force to make that struggle survivable in the first place. Without it, the entire idea of a small group of people successfully bringing down an animal that size would have bordered on fantasy. Here is a small mystery tucked inside this story that I still find myself turning over from time to time. Of every continent on this earth, Africa is the one place where archaeologists have not yet found solid evidence of the Atlatl ever being used, despite the fact that modern humans themselves first emerged there long before any of these other regions were ever settled by our species at all. Nobody knows exactly why. It could simply be that the wood and antler these tools were carved from broke down long before any archaeologist arrived to find it, given how rarely organic material survives that kind of stretch of time. It could be that African hunters working in different landscapes against different prey found other methods that suited their world better and never needed this particular solution at all. I would rather sit honestly with that uncertainty than pretend we have a tidy answer we simply do not have yet. Some questions in history stay open for a very long time, and I think there is something worth respecting in admitting that plainly, rather than rushing to fill the silence with a guess dressed up as fact. What I can tell you with more confidence is how long this particular tool managed to stay useful. In most parts of the world, something new eventually came along to challenge it. A lighter, quieter, ultimately more efficient way to launch a projectile, which we'll spend real time with together very soon in this story. But the atlatl did not simply vanish the moment that competition appeared. In parts of Mesoamerica, it remained in active everyday use for thousands of years, longer than in most other regions right up through the era of the Aztec Empire. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, they encountered Aztec warriors still fighting with this exact tool, called an atlatl in their own Nahuatl language, effective enough even against soldiers carrying steel and gunpowder that it earned genuine respect and fear from the very people who eventually recorded its name. Spanish accounts from that period describe darts launched from these weapons capable of punching straight through the layered cotton armor common among the era's soldiers, and in some cases even through the metal armor European soldiers had carried across an entire ocean specifically because they trusted it to protect them. Imagine being one of those soldiers confident in centuries of European weapons technology, only to discover that a tool refined by hunters on the opposite side of the world developed entirely independently could match or exceed what you had brought with you. That must have been a deeply unsettling realization, and it says something important about how easily we assume our own technology represents the most advanced version anything could ever become. The word atlatl itself actually comes directly from that same Nahuatl language, which means that every single time any of us says that word today, we're still speaking without realizing it, in a language shaped by the very hunters who once relied on this tool most skillfully. Have you ever used a piece of everyday equipment so regularly that you stopped noticing how remarkably clever its original design actually was? I think that happens to nearly everything. Eventually, even something as impressive as this. What strikes me most sitting with this story tonight is how much raw ingenuity lived inside something this small. No metal was involved, no complicated machinery, just a careful understanding of leverage motion and timing worked out through what must have been countless quiet afternoons of trial failure and small adjustment long before anyone had a word for physics or a classroom to teach it in. Somebody somewhere threw a spear with a longer stick instead of a bare hand, noticed it flew faster, and decided that small discovery was worth refining. Worth carving carefully, worth passing down to their own children, rather than letting it disappear the moment they were gone. I wonder sometimes how many small brilliant ideas like this one never made it past that very first stage, tried once, by someone who never thought to keep at it, or never had anyone nearby willing to learn it and carry it forward. For every atlatl that survived long enough to reach us, carved carefully enough into bone or antler to outlast tens of thousands of years underground, how many equally clever solutions simply vanished the moment the one person who understood them was gone? It is a slightly humbling thought to sit with tonight that history is not really a record of every good idea humans have ever had. It is closer to a record of the rare ones that happen to survive. There is something worth carrying with you in that too, I think, long after tonight's story ends. Real innovation rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it looks exactly like this. A small, unglamorous adjustment to something ordinary, a slightly longer stick, a slightly different angle, quietly changing what was possible for every single hunter who came after. What in your own life right now might be exactly that? A small, unglamorous adjustment you have not quite gotten around to trying, yet simply because it does not look impressive enough to bother with. Not every problem in this long story, though, could be solved by one clever hunter, working alone with a better tool in hand. Sometimes feeding an entire community through a long, hard season required something far bigger than any single weapon could ever provide, an entire group of people working together, turning the landscape itself into the only weapon that truly mattered. There is a place in southern Alberta, Canada, with a name so unsettling that most people assume at first it must be some kind of exaggeration for tourists. It is not. The site is called Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, and before we get to the rather grim story behind that name, I want to walk you through exactly what happened at this place for nearly 6,000 years, because I think the scale of it deserves to be understood properly first. This is a story about an entire community turning the land itself into the deadliest tool anyone in this whole journey tonight has used so far. Picture standing at the base of a sandstone cliff on a warm afternoon somewhere in late summer, the prairie stretching out flat and golden in every direction, as far as your eye could follow. Nothing about the scene would strike you as dangerous at first. A herd of bison grazes calmly in the distance, tails flicking lazily against flies, entirely unaware that they are already standing inside a trap built with almost unimaginable patience, one that will not spring shut with a snap or a sudden noise, but with something far quieter, far more deliberate, unfolding across an afternoon that has been carefully planned for longer than most of us could ever properly comprehend. Widen that view a little out across the Porcupine Hills themselves, herds of bison grazing peacefully the way they had for thousands of generations, unaware that the very ground beneath their hooves had been quietly, carefully prepared against them. Long before any single animal was driven anywhere, hunters had already built something remarkable across the landscape itself, rows of stone piles called cairns, sometimes stretching for miles, forming what are known as drive lanes, funnel-shaped corridors of stacked stone leading toward one specific, carefully chosen point. At the end of that corridor sat a sandstone cliff rising roughly the height of a 3-story building, quiet, unremarkable to look at, and absolutely lethal to whatever eventually found itself running toward its edge at full speed. Would you have guessed that some of the deadliest hunting equipment in human history was never a weapon at all, but rather an entire landscape rearranged patiently over generations into a trap no single animal could ever see coming? Getting a herd of bison to run in a specific direction is nowhere near as simple as it sounds, and this is where the actual cleverness of the whole operation reveals itself. Certain young men within the community trained specifically for this role, and known as buffalo runners, would dress themselves in the hides of wolves or coyotes, animals bison already instinctively feared and avoided, and move slowly along the edges of the grazing herd, nudging it patiently, almost imperceptibly, toward the mouth of that stone-lined corridor. Bison eyesight is not particularly sharp, and a person moving carefully within a wolf's silhouette downwind and unhurried could pass as exactly the kind of threat a herd already knew instinctively to keep its distance from. Once the herd had been coaxed into the drive lane itself, the rest of the community would rise up from behind the cairns, where they had been hiding, waving hides, shouting, making themselves as loud and threatening as possible all at once. Panic spreads through a herd of bison almost instantly, and once that panic takes hold, physics does something no single hunter could ever manage alone. The animals at the front of a stampeding herd cannot simply stop no matter how badly they might want to, because the sheer weight and momentum of hundreds of animals pressing forward behind them leaves no room for hesitation. By the time the leading bison actually see the cliff's edge open up in front of them, it is already far too late to do anything but fall. Here is a detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The very same young men who had spent the morning disguised as wolves patiently coaxing the herd forward were now running directly in front of an enormous, panicked, thundering mass of animals, and they had to stay there guiding the stampede's direction along the drive lane right up until the very last possible moment, before peeling off sharply to either side, letting the herd thunder past them toward the cliff. Misjudge that timing by even a second or two, and there would be nowhere left to go. This was not a job for the cautious. It required a kind of controlled, practiced bravery that most of us would struggle to summon even once, let alone as a responsibility repeated season after season, year after year, across an entire lifetime of hunts. Here is where that unsettling name finally makes sense. According to Blackfoot oral tradition passed down across generations long before any of this was written, in a book a young man once wanted to watch the full spectacle from directly beneath the cliff itself, curious to see the herd come crashing down from just a few steps away. He was caught underneath the falling animals, buried beneath the weight of the stampede, and later found by his own people, his skull crushed beneath the very bounty that would go on to feed them for months afterward. It is a small, sobering detail tucked inside an otherwise remarkable story, a reminder that even the most brilliant hunting strategy this continent ever produced still carried real, unavoidable danger for the people carrying it out. I want to sit with the sheer scale of what this single strategy could accomplish, because I think it is truly difficult to picture properly without real numbers attached to it. A single successful jump could yield well over 80,000 kilograms of usable meat in one single event, an amount some researchers have described, without much exaggeration, as among the most productive food-gathering achievements ever devised by any people anywhere on this earth. Compare that to a single hunter with a spear, or even an entire family working together with an atlatl across an entire season, and the difference in scale becomes almost impossible to overstate. One well-executed jump could feed an entire community clear through the harshest months of winter, when almost nothing else across that landscape offered any reliable food at all. Think back for a moment to everything we've already walked through together tonight: a single spear, a single sprint across open desert, a single hand cradling an atlatl. Every one of those stories, remarkable as they were, fed a family, maybe two. What happened at this cliff fed entire bands of people at once, sometimes several bands gathering together specifically because word had spread that a jump was being planned, drawn by the promise of a bounty large enough to share. It is a completely different scale of thinking, less about one clever person solving one immediate problem, and more about an entire society organizing itself generation after generation around a single, perfectly refined strategy. None of that abundance simply appeared on its own, though. Once the animals lay at the base of the cliff, an enormous communal effort began almost immediately. Women, men, and children working together at a butchering camp set up specifically for this purpose. Meat was dried carefully in the sun and open air to preserve it. Hides were scraped, tanned, and sewn into clothing and shelter, sturdy enough to survive a properly brutal winter. Even the animal's stomach and bladder found use, transformed into containers for boiling water and rendering fat, and a significant portion of the meat was pounded together with fat and dried berries into something called pemmican, an early form of preserved portable food, dense enough in calories that a fairly small amount could sustain a person through weeks of hardship when fresh food simply was not available. Have you ever thrown away food without a second thought, simply because using every last part of it felt like more trouble than it was worth? I think about that rather differently after learning how completely a single bison was accounted for here. Nothing wasted, everything from hide to stomach to bone put toward keeping people alive through a season that offered very little forgiveness for carelessness. It makes our own relationship with food today conveniently packaged, easily replaced endlessly available feel almost strange by comparison, a luxury so complete that most of us rarely stop to notice it as one at all. There was a spiritual weight to all of this too, one that I think deserves real respect rather than a passing mention. The young men chosen to disguise themselves as wolves and guide the herd toward its end were regarded within Blackfoot tradition as something akin to gifts from the Creator, entrusted with an enormous responsibility on behalf of their entire community. The night before a hunt, these same young men would often purify themselves inside a sweat lodge, a ceremonial structure meant to cleanse both body and spirit, quite literally sweating away their own human scent, so the herd would have less reason to grow suspicious of them. Every animal that fell that day was understood as an offering, not simply a resource to be claimed. Injured animals that survived the fall were dispatched quickly and respectfully, rather than left to suffer, and their sacrifice was acknowledged with real gratitude rather than treated as something owed automatically to the people who depended on it. This entire system did not appear overnight either, and it did not disappear quickly. Archaeological evidence at this exact site stretches back nearly 6,000 years, layer upon layer of bone and stone tools built up gradually beneath that same cliff generation after generation, refining the same fundamental strategy, adjusting drive lanes, improving timing, passing down an intimate understanding of bison behavior that took an almost unimaginable span of time to fully develop. This was not a lucky discovery stumbled into once and simply repeated afterward without further thought. It was continuously tested, adjusted and perfected across a length of time, longer than the entire history of most civilizations most of us learned about in school. Archaeologists digging down through those same layers of earth beneath the cliff have found something almost poetic in how the evidence itself is arranged. Distinct bands of bone and ash and tool fragments stacked one on top of another, each layer representing another jump, another season, another generation, adding its own small refinement to a strategy that was never quite finished improving. Reading that stratified ground is in its own way not so different from reading a family history written directly into the earth. One hunt at a time, stretching back further than written language itself existed anywhere on this earth. It came to an end in the end not because the strategy stopped working, but because the world around it changed in ways nobody standing on that cliff generations earlier could ever have anticipated. Through the 1800s, as settlers moved across the continent and commercial hunting spread rapidly westward, the vast herds of bison that had once seemed endless were driven to the edge of extinction within just a few short decades. By 1881, the population had collapsed so severely that a hunting strategy built entirely around enormous predictable herds simply had nothing left to work with. The Blackfoot people themselves were increasingly confined to reserves. During this same period, their traditional way of life disrupted by forces entirely outside their own control. A tradition refined patiently across 6,000 years came to an end within the span of a single difficult generation. A sobering reminder of just how quickly something built across an almost unimaginable stretch of time can still be lost. I do not think that part of the story should be softened or rushed past even in a telling meant to help you drift off peacefully tonight. 6,000 years of accumulated skill, spiritual practice and community organization gone within a matter of decades is not a small loss tucked quietly into the footnotes of history. It is worth sitting with honestly alongside everything remarkable about what came before it, rather than treated as a simple, tidy ending to an otherwise inspiring story. Today, that same cliff still stands quiet, now protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, drawing visitors from across the world into an interpretive centre built directly into the sandstone itself. Since it opened in the late 1980s, millions of people have walked through its halls, and the site continues to be cared for and interpreted with real involvement from Blackfoot communities themselves, ensuring the story told there comes from the people who actually lived it, rather than filtered entirely through outside eyes. Walking those same drive lanes past cairns still visible after thousands of years offers something rather different from reading about it in a book, a chance to stand inside a piece of engineering built not from metal or stone shaped by tools, but from an entire landscape understood so completely that it could be turned gently and patiently into exactly what an entire community needed it to become. Feeding a community through raw scale, though impressive as it was never the only path forward that hunters on this earth discovered. Somewhere else in this long story, a much quieter, more solitary invention was about to change everything, all over again. Something small enough to carry in a single hand, yet precise enough to let one hunter alone accomplish silently at a real distance what an entire community here once needed: a cliff, a herd and generations of accumulated knowledge to achieve together. It would not replace what happened at cliffs like this one, not for a very long time yet, but it would offer something this particular strategy never quite could: the freedom to hunt effectively without a cliff at all, without hundreds of cairns, without an entire community organized around one single afternoon. Somewhere long before anyone kept records of such things, a person picked up a bent, springy branch, noticed how hard it fought back against being pulled straight, and had a thought that would eventually reshape almost every hunting culture on this earth. What if that fight, that stubborn, springy resistance, could be stored up carefully and then released all at once in a single controlled instant aimed exactly where it needed to go? That thought became the bow, and I want to spend tonight's story properly with it, because I think it deserves far more credit than the simple, almost childish image most of us carry around in our heads, a toy version tucked into a costume or a cartoon hero, drawing back an arrow with a wink and a grin. The real story underneath that familiar shape is considerably older, considerably stranger, and considerably more remarkable than anything a costume shop or a cartoon could ever properly capture. Let's talk about where the evidence actually begins, because it goes back considerably further than most people assume. In a cave site in South Africa, archaeologists have uncovered small, carefully worked stone points, shaped and damaged in ways that strongly resemble arrowheads, dating back an almost unbelievable 71,000 years. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. It would place the earliest hints of this technology further back in time than nearly everything else we've walked through together tonight, hinting that our species may have been experimenting with stored released energy considerably earlier than most textbooks have traditionally suggested, proving that those particular stones actually flew from a bow rather than simply being sharp fragments used for some other purpose entirely, has taken careful, patient detective work. Researchers studied the exact patterns of damage along the edges of these small points, the specific kind of fracturing that happens when a stone tip strikes something at very high speed, and compared it against damage produced by controlled modern experiments, points thrown by hand points mounted on spears and points shot from replica bows. The particular signature left behind matched the bow far more closely than any other method they tested. It is the kind of evidence that will never feel as satisfying as finding an actual intact weapon resting in the dirt. But it is compelling all the same, a careful argument built entirely from the way broken stone breaks. The oldest complete bow anyone has actually recovered rather than simply inferred from damaged stone points comes from a much more recent site, a waterlogged bog near a place called Stellmore in what is now Germany. Preserved in mud for roughly 11,000 years, crafted from pine and clearly built by hunters, following reindeer herds across a landscape still recovering from the retreat of Ice Age glaciers. Bogs like that one have an almost eerie talent for preservation, cold low in oxygen, acidic enough to slow decay to an absolute crawl, which is the only reason wood this old still exists for anyone to study at all. Alongside that bow, Archaeologists also recovered pine arrow shafts, some snapped, some still whole, scattered evidence of a hunting camp where these tools were made used, repaired and eventually lost or discarded in the exact same mud that would go on to protect them for 11,000 years afterward. Between that 71,000-year-old hint and this 11,000-year-old certainty sits an enormous, largely silent stretch of time, one where wood and sinew simply did not survive long enough for us to properly trace exactly how this idea grew tested and slowly proved itself across who knows how many failed attempts along the way. Would you have guessed that something as ordinary looking as a bent stick and a length of string represents one of the most significant leaps in the entire history of human hunting? Here is where I think the real cleverness of this invention becomes clear, and it works on a completely different principle than the leverage trick we spent time with earlier tonight. An atlatl extends the arm, multiplying the speed of a single immediate throw. A bow does something else entirely. It stores energy slowly, patiently across the entire length of the draw, the way pulling back a rubber band stores a small amount of tension you can feel building in your fingers the further you stretch it. Draw a bow back fully, and you're essentially loading a spring built from wood and sinew, holding real considerable force in check for exactly as long as you choose, before releasing every bit of it in a single explosive instant aimed with a precision no full-body throwing motion could ever quite match. Think about a playground swing for a moment, pulled back and held just before someone lets go. All that stored potential waiting, patiently doing nothing at all, until the exact moment it is released. A drawn bow works on that same basic principle, except the energy stored inside it does not simply swing forward and back. It launches an arrow fast enough and far enough to change the entire relationship between a hunter and the animal standing across the field from them. Picture a hunter crouched low at the edge of a clearing, an arrow already knocked against the string, breath slow and even, watching a deer lower its head to graze 30 paces away. There is no need for the dramatic backswing an atlatl throw would demand no sudden movement to catch the animal's attention at the worst possible moment. Just a slow, controlled draw, the string pulled back to the corner of the mouth, held there for a single steady breath, and released. The whole motion start to finish might take less time than reading this very sentence aloud, and it happens with barely more visible movement than a person shifting their weight from one foot to the other. That precision came with practical advantages that mattered enormously to someone trying to actually feed a family, advantages worth sitting with properly rather than rushing past. An atlatl dart is a substantial piece of equipment heavy enough that a hunter could realistically carry only a handful on any single outing. An arrow, by comparison, is remarkably light, which meant a single quiver slung comfortably across one shoulder could hold a dozen or more of them at once. Suddenly a hunter was no longer limited to 2 or 3 attempts before needing to retreat, gather more equipment and start the entire hunt over again. One missed shot simply meant reaching for the next arrow already within easy reach, already ready to fly. There is a quieter advantage too, one that mattered just as much in the moment itself. Throwing an atlatl dart requires real visible motion, a full extension of the arm and shoulder that all but announces a hunter's presence to anything nearby paying attention. Drawing and releasing a bow, once properly practiced, can happen from a position of almost complete stillness, crouched low, barely moving at all until the very instant of release. For an animal already alert to danger, that difference between a dramatic sweeping throw and a nearly silent controlled release could easily be the entire difference between a successful hunt and an empty-handed walk home. I find myself wondering sometimes whether the person who first perfected this technique fully understood what they were setting in motion, or whether it simply felt to them like a small practical improvement over what had worked well enough the season before. Most genuine turning points in history rarely announce themselves as turning points while they are actually happening. They tend to look at the time like nothing more than a slightly better way of doing something perfectly ordinary. This particular improvement did not stay confined to hunting for very long either, and I think honesty requires us to sit with that fact rather than skip past it, simply because it complicates an otherwise inspiring story. Archaeologists working in Kenya uncovered the remains of a group of people dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, showing clear evidence of violent conflict, including wounds, consistent with arrows tipped with sharpened volcanic glass. Any tool capable of striking cleanly and silently from a real distance was never going to remain confined to animals alone, and the bow's story, like so many of humanity's most useful inventions, carries this harder edge running quietly alongside its more familiar role feeding families through difficult seasons. I think it is worth naming that plainly rather than pretending every ancient innovation we celebrate together was only ever used gently. The visual record left behind by these early archers survives in some remarkable places too. Rock art scattered across parts of Spain painted by hands working thousands of years ago depicts figures drawing bows against large horned animals frozen mid-motion in red and black pigment that has somehow survived open air and weather across an almost unthinkable stretch of time. Some of these painted hunters appear mid-stride legs, bent bows, fully drawn arrows about to leave the string, captured with a surprising amount of anatomical detail for people working entirely without formal training in anything we would recognize as art today. Others show entire lines of archers moving together, coordinated clearly, working as a group rather than hunting alone, suggesting these scenes were not casual doodles, but deliberate records of moments that truly mattered to the people who painted them. Standing in front of images like that, knowing the artist watching that exact hunt unfold, felt strongly enough about the moment to paint it onto stone, rather than simply let the memory fade, tells you something about how significant this particular skill must have felt to the people actually living it. Here is something worth noticing about how differently this technology spread once it existed. In much of Europe, the bow largely replaced the atlatl within a few thousand years, becoming the dominant hunting tool across an enormous stretch of the continent. Elsewhere, that same transition happened far more slowly or unevenly, shaped by local prey, local materials, and local tradition, rather than following any single universal timeline. In parts of North America, for instance, communities continued relying heavily on the atlatl for thousands of years after the bow had already become common elsewhere, only shifting over more fully in the centuries closer to what we would now call the first millennium. Adoption was never automatic and it was never uniform. Some regions embraced this new technology almost immediately. Others held on to older methods for reasons of their own. Reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with which tool was objectively better on paper, and everything to do with what actually worked generation after generation in one particular corner of this enormous earth. We will meet at least one especially striking example of that pattern again before tonight's journey is finished, a whole continent, in fact, that looked at this very tool and largely chose to keep walking its own separate path instead. Have you ever kept using an older method for something even after a newer option existed simply because it worked well enough and you saw no real reason to change? I suspect that instinct is considerably older than any of us tend to give it credit for. What moves me most about the bow, sitting with its whole story properly tonight, is how much quiet, patient trial and error must have gone into something we now think of as almost too simple to really notice. Choosing the right wood, one springy enough to store energy without splitting under real tension. Finding a cord strong enough to survive being pulled taut again and again without fraying apart. learning through what must have been years of failed attempts, exactly how far to draw, exactly how to release, exactly how to stand so an arrow actually travelled where it was aimed rather than tumbling uselessly into the grass. None of that knowledge arrived all at once. It was earned slowly by people willing to keep adjusting long after most of us would have given up entirely. I think about how many broken bows snapped mid-draw must have littered campsites across those early centuries. How many arrows must have splintered against a tree instead of finding their target? How many hunters walked home empty-handed after a design simply failed at the worst possible moment? We do not get to see any of that in the archaeological record, only the rare successes durable enough to survive burial for thousands of years. But failure was clearly there too, quietly, patiently teaching each new generation exactly what not to try again. That is a kind of knowledge just as valuable as any finished bow we have ever pulled from the ground, even though it left behind nothing solid enough to dig up and study directly. But not every hunter who came after this invention needed to be present at the moment of the catch at all. Somewhere else in this long story, an entirely different kind of cleverness was taking shape, one built not around striking quickly from a distance, but around patience of a completely different sort. A trap set carefully, once, then simply left to do its own quiet work, while the person who built it walked away entirely. If the bow represents everything a single hunter could accomplish, standing perfectly still for one careful, decisive instant, what came next asked for something almost opposite the discipline to build something well enough, once that it kept working faithfully whether anyone stayed to watch it or not. Building something that keeps working after you walk away sounds almost too modern a concept to belong in a story this old, and yet that is precisely what a quiet stretch of Europe figured out long before anyone had a word for patience as a strategy rather than simply a virtue. Let's travel to a gentler kind of water for a while, because I think our story has earned a break from ice and heat and open ocean. Picture a slow, winding river somewhere in what we now call Ireland, its surface calm enough to reflect the sky back at itself. On a still morning, the banks lined with reeds and low-tangled brush. Nothing about this scene looks like the setting for a hunt. There is no chase here, no drawn bow, no disguise, no cliff. And that, it turns out, was exactly the point. In 2004, road construction workers in County Meath, Ireland, uncovered something nobody expected to find, buried beneath the ground they were preparing to pave over. Following behind them, an archaeologist named Matthew Mossop and his team carefully excavated what turned out to be an ancient mooring site, and among the fragments recovered from the wet, oxygen-starved soil that had protected it so well, one object stood out as remarkably complete: a woven basket, conical in shape, roughly the length of your forearm, stretched twice, over patiently constructed from thin strips of alder birch and other local wood bent and interlaced by hands, working somewhere between 5,200 and nearly 5,000 years before our own conversation tonight. The basket had been badly flattened by thousands of years of earth and bog pressing down on it, and the conservation team who eventually lifted it free of the ground spent nearly 3 years carefully stabilizing the fragile waterlogged wood before it could even be safely displayed. A local master basket maker was later asked to weave a faithful replica, following the same technique as closely as anyone could reconstruct it, partly so museum visitors could finally see standing upright and whole what this object would have actually looked like the day it was first lowered into the water, rather than the flattened, careful ruin archaeologists were left to interpret from the ground. Would you have guessed that a simple woven basket, the kind of thing you might glance past in a craft market without a second thought, could actually be one of the most quietly revolutionary hunting tools in the whole of human history? Here is the idea underneath it, and I think it deserves to be sat with properly. because it represents something truly different from every method we've explored together so far tonight. Every single strategy up to this point has required a person's active presence at the exact moment of the catch, a hand gripping a spear, a lung full of breath held before a blowgun, an arm drawn back with a bow. A fish weir asks for none of that. Build the trap correctly, place it at the right narrowing point in a river or the mouth of a tidal channel, and the fish do the rest of the work themselves, swimming forward with the current funneled gradually into a narrowing chamber. They can enter easily enough, but can never quite work out how to swim back out of again. Think about what that actually meant for the person who built it. While that basket sat quietly in the water doing its work, its maker was free to do something else entirely. Gather firewood, mend a garment, watch over a child, or simply rest. I like to think of it, only half joking, as one of the very first working examples of passive income in human history, a single well-built object generating food on its own schedule, whether or not anyone happened to be standing there supervising it at the time. Consider for a moment just how different that must have felt compared to everything else we have spent time with together tonight. A hunter chasing a kudu across the open desert cannot simply stop halfway through and wander off to do other chores. An archer bow, drawn waiting for exactly the right instant to release, is entirely present for that one decisive breath, with nothing left over for anything else. But a fish weir, once properly built and positioned, keeps working steadily whether its maker is standing right beside it or 3 fields away entirely. That is not a small difference. It represents an entirely different relationship with time itself, one where effort spent once carefully up front could keep quietly paying off for days, months, sometimes years afterward, freeing up hours that earlier methods simply demanded be spent standing watch. Would you trade a guaranteed catch requiring hours of your undivided attention for a smaller, steadier one that let you get on with the rest of your day? Instead, I suspect most of us, if we are honest, would choose exactly what these river communities chose again and again for thousands of years running. Ireland was far from the only place this idea took hold either. Similar wooden fish traps and weirs have turned up across a remarkable stretch of northern Europe, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Russia, each one built independently by communities working entirely on their own, arriving at strikingly similar solutions to the exact same basic problem. Along the Liffey estuary in what is now Dublin, archaeologists uncovered rows of wooden stakes stretching 25 metres through the mud remnants of a weir, built along principles nearly identical to the one recovered further inland at County Meath, even though the 2 sites were likely built by entirely separate communities working generations apart. At a site called Tegerup in Sweden, similar wattle fencing turns up in the archaeological record, smaller in scale, but built on the exact same underlying logic funnel, shape positioned precisely designed to let the current itself do the labour. Researchers studying wooden eel weirs in Denmark have described the underlying technique as one that remained in continuous use for roughly 7,000 years, an almost unbelievable span of time for a single method of catching fish to stay relevant, refined only gradually, generation after generation rather than replaced outright by something else entirely. One particularly striking site, a place called Siltholm Fjord in Denmark, gave archaeologists an almost unheard of window into just how extensive this practice eventually became. Excavations there covering dozens of hectares of what was once an ancient waterlogged fjord uncovered entire networks of wooden stakes and posts driven into the seabed, evidence of fishing structures maintained continuously from the Mesolithic period all the way through the Bronze Age, meaning families were tending, repairing and rebuilding these same traps across a length of time longer than the entire recorded history of most nations that exist on this earth today. What struck the archaeologists working that site was not simply the age of what they found, but the sheer density of its individual weir systems distinguishable from one another, overlapping in places evidence of one generation's structure being dismantled and rebuilt slightly differently by the next, as though the river itself had been in a slow, patient conversation with the people, living alongside it for thousands of years, running each side, adjusting gradually to what the other had to offer. I want to pause on that detail for a moment because I think it says something rather profound about how differently these communities related to time itself compared to how most of us tend to think about our own days. A trap left overnight and checked in the morning is one kind of patience. A technique passed down essentially unchanged in its core principle across 7,000 years is something else entirely, patience stretched out not across a single lifetime, but across roughly 350 generations, each one trusting that the same basic idea, refined only slightly, would keep working exactly as well as it had for their grandparents and their grandparents before them. Have you ever built or started something specifically so that it would keep quietly working long after you had personally stopped paying attention to it? I suspect most of us have done some small version of that ourselves, and there is something rather comforting in learning just how ancient that particular instinct actually is. Making one of these traps well enough to actually survive the water it sat in required real considerable skill, the kind that could not simply be improvised on a single afternoon. Choosing wood flexible enough to bend into a tight funnel, shaped weave without splitting apart under constant pressure from moving water. Understanding exactly how tightly to interlace each strip so the structure held firm against a current, yet still allowed water to pass cleanly through it, carrying scent and movement toward the fish being drawn steadily inward. Positioning the whole structure at precisely the correct point in a river or tidal channel, somewhere narrow enough to naturally concentrate fish traffic, without choosing a spot so exposed that the very first serious flood would simply carry the entire thing away downstream. None of that came from luck. It came from watching water patiently across countless seasons, until its behavior became almost as familiar and predictable as a well-known face. Some communities working near tidal estuaries took this idea a step further, still timing their traps to work with the rhythm of the sea itself rather than fighting against it. Positioned correctly along a falling tide, a weir could strand fish behind its walls twice a day, every single day, without a single extra motion required from the person who built it, the moon and the ocean doing the scheduling entirely on their own. It is a small, quiet kind of genius, noticing that the world already repeats certain patterns reliably enough to be trusted, and simply building something that knows how to wait for its cue. This particular kind of knowledge remarkably never fully disappeared from Ireland at all. Along a remote stretch of coastline in Connemara on the western edge of the country, a man named John Folan has continued making traps very similar in spirit to that ancient basket recovered from County Meath, learning the craft directly from his own father and grandfather, who learned it from the generations before them in turn. These traps, known locally as cochill, are built to catch small fish gathering seasonally near coastal lagoons, and though modern materials like wire mesh have sometimes replaced the traditional woven rods, the underlying design, the fundamental logic of funneling water and fish into a narrowing chamber that offers no easy way back out has barely changed in thousands of years. When an archaeologist eventually visited that same stretch of coastline and connected what he found there to older, more famous excavations, Folan himself had apparently given very little thought to how remarkably old his family's methods actually were. To him this was simply how his father and his father's father had always done things, a practical, sensible way of putting food on the table during the lean early months of spring, not a piece of living archaeology worth documenting for its own sake. That gap between an ordinary family tradition and an object that turns out to belong to one of the oldest continuously practiced technologies in the whole of human history is one of my favourite kinds of discovery in stories like this one. Sometimes the most remarkable things sitting right in front of us have simply never been labelled remarkable by the people who grew up taking them completely for granted. Have you ever learned something from a parent or grandparent, some small practical skill passed along almost casually, without either of you ever pausing to wonder just how far back that particular thread of knowledge might actually stretch? When researchers eventually connected his family's traditional trap system to the same ancient design principles found in sites like Clowenstown, it confirmed something rather beautiful, that an idea first perfected during the Mesolithic period had never actually stopped being useful. It had simply kept working quietly generation after generation, quite literally quality, tested across thousands of years by the very fact that people never needed to abandon it for anything better. There is something worth carrying with you in that particular kind of continuity, I think, long after tonight's story moves along to wherever it takes us next. Not every great idea needs to be replaced simply because it is old. Sometimes the truest measure of how well something was designed in the first place is not how quickly it gets improved upon, but how many thousands of years it manages to quietly keep doing exactly what it was built to do, without ever really needing to change. Most of us exist now surrounded by objects designed to be replaced within a year or two, almost on purpose. There is a quiet kind of dignity in a design, instead built to still be useful 5,000 years later, asking nothing more of the people who inherit it than the patience to keep making it exactly the same way it has always been made. So picture it properly one last time before we leave this gentle river behind for tonight. Clear water slipping steadily through a woven basket, trapwood strips bent and interlaced by patient, careful hands, fish drawn inward by nothing more than the current itself doing all the actual hunting on its own, while somewhere nearby the person who built it is off tending a fire or teaching a child trusting a quiet river bend to keep its own patient promise until they return. There is a place on this earth where the calm water we just watched slip through those woven traps changes into something else completely. It hardens. It grows thick enough to walk across, thick enough to build a house on top of, and underneath it, an entire ocean keeps moving in the dark, hiding every fish and seal a person could ever hope to find. Out here there are no trees tall enough to carve a spear from no gentle river bend, calm enough to weave a basket trap into. If you want to eat in a place like this, you have to outthink the whole frozen sea itself, and for longer than anyone can properly measure, a group of people have been doing exactly that. We're heading north now, past where most of the world stops paying attention, into the kind of cold that turns breath into fog before it even leaves your mouth completely. The people who call this home have gone by many names over the centuries, though today most know them as the Inuits spread across the coastlines of the Canadian Arctic, Alaska and Greenland. And if you have ever pictured their way of hunting as some desperate scramble against nature, I would gently ask you to set that picture aside. What actually happened out on that ice was closer to a quiet, exact kind of science, built entirely from patience, sharp eyes, and materials pulled from the very animals they hunted. Long before the ancestors of today's Inuit ever paddled into these waters, an earlier group known to researchers as the Dorset people had already been surviving out here for thousands of years, hunting mostly from the shore without dog teams, without the larger skin boats that came later. Then around 1,000 years ago, a new culture began spreading east from Alaska, one archaeologist now called Thule. They carried improved harpoons, sturdier boats, and a deeper understanding of whale hunting, and within a few centuries they had spread clear across the top of this continent to Greenland, becoming the direct ancestors of Inuit communities alive today. Nothing about this world was ever standing still. Even out here on what looks like an empty, frozen nothing, whole generations were quietly refining their craft, passing lessons forward the same way people everywhere always have. Let's start with something you might not expect. Seals cannot breathe underwater any more than you or I can. They are mammals just like us, which means every few minutes, no matter how far they have swum beneath the ice, they have to come back up for air. Since a frozen sea has no open water for miles in any direction, seals solve this problem by carving their own breathing holes straight through the ice, using their claws and teeth, then returning to that same small opening again and again throughout the day, sometimes visiting several different holes to avoid being predictable. It is a clever survival trick. It is also, as it turns out, the seal's one true weakness. Finding one of these holes in the first place is not simple either. They're often no wider than a dinner plate, and drifted snow can hide them so well that even an experienced hunter might walk right past one without noticing a thing. So the search itself becomes its own quiet skill, noticing faint bumps in the snow, sensing where the surface looks just slightly different from everywhere around it, sometimes probing gently with a harpoon shaft to feel for the hollow space underneath. Once a hole is found, the real waiting begins. And here is something that might surprise you, especially if you picture this whole process as some guaranteed easy meal waiting at the end of a short wait. A single seal rarely relies on just one breathing hole. It often keeps a dozen or more scattered across a wide stretch of ice, using them unpredictably so no single spot becomes a trap it can learn to avoid. In one documented stretch of hunting recorded by researchers working alongside Inuit hunters in the Canadian Arctic, out of well over 200 breathing structures found across 31 days on the ice, only a small handful, somewhere around 3 dozen, actually ended in a successful kill. Most days out there ended in nothing at all, and still hunters went back out the next morning and the morning after that, because that is simply what patience actually requires of a person. Not one lucky moment, but a willingness to fail quietly over and over without ever letting it turn into giving up. None of that patience arrived overnight either. A boy might spend years standing quietly beside his father at the edge of a breathing hole before he was ever trusted to hold the harpoon himself, watching how his father studied the snow, how he judged the smallest shift in the air above the ice, how he stayed still long after most people would have given up and gone home. There was no shortcut through that apprenticeship, no way to rush it. Skill like that could only be earned by showing up season after season and simply paying attention. Here is where I want you to picture something for a moment. Could you stand completely still in air cold enough to sting exposed skin within minutes, staring down at a hole you cannot see into for 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes longer, not knowing if anything is even down there at all? Because that is exactly what an Inuit hunter would do, and the tool that made it possible is almost too delicate to believe. Let's slow down and follow one hunter through a single afternoon, because a list of facts rarely captures what this actually felt like. He's already been out since well before the pale winter sun cleared the horizon, walking a wide loop across the ice, watching for the smallest imperfection in the snow. By midday he has found what he is looking for, a patch barely different from everywhere else around it, soft enough underneath to hint at open water below. He kneels. He clears away the last dusting of snow with careful hands, never breaking the surface itself, because one wrong movement now could ruin hours of searching. Then he waits, weight balanced evenly, breath slowed on purpose, because even the fog from his own mouth rising too quickly could be enough to warn a cautious animal below. Hunters would take a thin strip of caribou tendon and attach to the end of it something impossibly soft, a bit of rabbit fur, or better still a single filament of snow goose down. This little instrument would then be lowered gently into the breathing hole until it rested just above the water below. When a seal finally rose to breathe, the smallest ripple from its exhale would lift that feather just barely, just enough for a watching hunter to catch the movement out of the corner of his eye. No sound, no splash loud enough to hear, only the faintest twitch of down against tendon in the middle of complete silence, telling one person that somewhere beneath their feet a life had just surfaced. And here is the detail that I think about more than almost anything else in this whole story. When a seal breaks the surface of its breathing hole, the very first thing it does is breathe out forcefully, clearing the stale air trapped in that narrow space. For that one brief moment, the animal cannot properly smell anything at all, and its own breath actually pushes any trace of human scent up and away before the seal can draw its next breath in. It is a tiny window, maybe a second or two, and a skilled hunter learned to strike inside that exact heartbeat of time, moving hard and fast the instant the feather shifted before the seal ever had a chance to sense the danger waiting above it. Now, what happens the moment that harpoon makes contact is where the real engineering shows itself. Unlike a simple spear which just punches a hole and can slip right back out, an Inuit harpoon carried a head that was built to detach on impact and turn sideways underneath the seal's skin, wedging itself in place like a small anchor. Pull straight back on it, and it only grips tighter. There was no way for a wounded, panicked seal to simply yank itself free and vanish back down into deep water, which had always been the single hardest part of hunting an animal that lived mostly out of sight beneath a frozen ceiling. You have actually used this exact idea yourself, probably without ever realizing it. The next time you hang something heavy on a hollow wall, using what hardware stores call a toggle bolt, that small metal piece that flips sideways once it passes through the wall to hold weight it could never support head-on. You're relying on the very same physics an Arctic hunter figured out with bone and sinew long before anyone had a word for engineering at all. Not every hunt happened at a quiet hole in the ice, though. For open water, hunters built something you have almost certainly seen a version of, even if you never knew where it truly came from. The kayak or kajak in their own language was built from a light frame of driftwood or whalebone lashed together with sinew. Since there was rarely any metal or nails to spare, then stretched tight with seal skin, sewn so carefully that the seam stayed watertight even in rough seas. The whole craft, once finished, often weighed little more than a grown man could lift over one shoulder, narrow, lightweight, and built to carry exactly one person low and nearly silent across the surface of the sea. A hunter could paddle up on a resting seal so quietly that the animal sometimes never noticed anything was wrong until it was already too late. Have you ever tried to sneak up on anything, a bird in your backyard maybe, or a cat that absolutely refuses to be caught? Now imagine doing that in freezing open water alone in a boat you built with your own hands, hunting an animal that could easily outswim you the moment it noticed you were there. For something as large as a walrus weighing well over 1,000 pounds, a lone hunter in a small skin boat needed more than nerve. Attached to the harpoon line was often an inflated sealskin float, acting almost like a brake dragging against the water to stop the wounded animal from diving too deep or swimming too far before it tired. One person, one boat, one carefully placed strike against an animal that could have crushed that same little craft without even trying. If that does not count as impressive, I honestly do not know what would. And then there was the whale. This is the part of the story that still catches me off guard every single time I sit with it, because it says something about these hunters that has nothing to do with strength at all. Once a whale had been struck, hunters did not chase it, did not fight it, did not try to force the outcome through sheer effort. Instead, according to people who have spent years documenting these traditions firsthand, a hunter would simply wait, trusting the currents, the moving air above the waves, and what they believed to be watchful spirits, to slowly carry that whale back toward the shore on its own. Not conquest. Patience dressed up as faith. When a whale did finally reach the shore, it was never treated as one family's private catch. Word travelled fast along the coastline, and soon enough an entire settlement would gather, sometimes people from neighbouring camps as well, all working together to bring in meat, fat and bone that could feed dozens of families clear through the darkest, hungriest months of winter. Nothing on quite that scale could ever come from one person hunting alone, no matter how skilled they were. A whale meant survival was suddenly briefly no longer something anyone had to worry about, and that kind of relief shared across an entire community at once must have felt something like a small miracle. I find something quietly moving in that. So much of the world around us rewards whoever pushes hardest, whoever grabs fastest, whoever refuses to simply wait for anything. And here, in one of the harshest places a person could try to survive, an entire way of life was built instead around stillness, around trusting a process bigger than any single person's strength. A mother back at camp feeding a fire, teaching a daughter how to soften a sealskin boot, was relying on that same quiet trust every single day that patience done properly feeds a family just as surely as force ever could. That boot making, by the way, was not some small side skill separate from hunting. It was the entire reason hunting was even possible in the first place. Standing motionless over a breathing hole for 3 or 4 hours in bitter cold demands, clothing sewn with an almost unbelievable level of care, layers of caribou fur, trapping warm air near the skin, and sealskin boots stitched with a seam so tight and so fine that not a single drop of water could work its way through. That sewing skill was passed down almost entirely from mother to daughter, generation after generation, and without it no hunter, no matter how patient or how skilled with a harpoon, would have lasted an hour out on that ice before the cold simply won. The hunt everyone remembers, the dramatic moment with the harpoon, only ever happened because of quieter, less celebrated work that came long before it. If stillness beside a hole in the ice can keep an entire community alive through a polar winter, imagine what that same kind of patience looks like, somewhere completely different, somewhere warm, crowded and dripping with humidity instead of frost. Two extremes on opposite ends of our Earth, and yet strangely the same core lesson waiting in both places, that the loudest, most forceful approach is rarely the one that actually works. Because not far from here in our story, in the thick tangled canopy of a rainforest half a world away, there are hunters who also learn to disappear into complete silence, holding their breath in the leaves overhead, waiting to release something far quieter than any harpoon and far more mysterious than ice. High in the canopy of the Amazon rainforest, sound behaves differently than it does almost anywhere else on this earth. Down near the forest floor, a single snapped twig can travel a surprising distance through the trees. But up above, where whole families of monkeys spend nearly the whole of their existence leaping from branch to branch, a troop can lose one of its own and never even notice, because the moment that took him never made a sound in the first place. A hunter has been sitting motionless in that same tree for the better part of an hour, legs wrapped around a branch, back pressed flat against the trunk, watching a group of monkeys feed on fruit just above him. Sweat gathers along his hairline, and he does not wipe it away because even that small motion could catch the wrong pair of eyes. In his hands is a length of hollow wood, sometimes taller than the hunter himself, and resting inside it a dart no heavier than a toothpick, its tip coated in something dark and faintly sticky. He raises the tube slowly, so slowly that even the leaves barely stir lines up his breath with his shot, and exhales sharp and short through the full length of the tube. There is no explosion, no splash, no sudden movement to give anything away. Just a soft puff of air quieter than a sneeze, and somewhere above him, a monkey's grip on its branch begins to loosen. We have travelled over the last little while together across freezing seas and open plains and quiet European rivers. Tonight we land somewhere entirely different in the wet, tangled heart of the Amazon rainforest home, to more kinds of trees in a single square mile than exist across the whole of North America. And here the old rules about hunting change completely. There is very little open ground to speak of almost no large animals wandering across a plain the way a herd of bison once did. Nearly everything worth eating stays up in the branches out of reach, moving fast and rarely holding still for more than a few seconds at a time. So the people who have called this forest home for thousands of years had to solve an entirely different kind of problem. How do you hunt something that spends its whole life above your head? The answer they arrived at was the blowgun, and if you picture something crude, a hollow stick a child might carve for fun, I would ask you to think again. Among certain communities deep in the rainforest, such as the Matis people of the Brazilian Amazon, a hunting blowgun could stretch beyond 10 feet in length, carefully split from a single piece of palm wood, hollowed out with painstaking care, then bound together and coated in tree resin, until the seam disappeared completely, and not a breath of air could escape along its length. A dart thin as a splinter would be fitted with a small puff of fibre called kapok near its base, soft and light, almost like cotton, just wide enough to seal the tube around it. The same basic idea a musket ball uses today, though invented in a forest with none of a musket's noise. Have you ever tried blowing out a single candle from clear across a room and actually hit it on your first try? Now imagine doing that with something the size of a splinter, aimed at a moving target 30 feet above your head, hidden behind a screen of leaves while trying not to make a single unnecessary sound. That kind of accuracy does not happen by accident. Children in these communities often begin practicing years before adulthood, and it usually takes most of that time before a hunter's aim can be trusted on a real hunt. But the tube and the dart were never really the weapon. The weapon was what waited on the tip. Deep in the forest grow certain vines, mainly from two families of plants that botanists today call strychnos and chondrodendron, and from their bark and stems hunters learn to draw out one of the most effective poisons that nature has ever produced. Most of the world knows it today by a single word curare, though the exact recipe, the mixture of plants, the boiling time, the order, everything gets added has always varied from one community to the next, guarded and passed down the same careful way a family recipe might be handed from a grandmother to a granddaughter, except that getting a step wrong here could cost far more than a ruined meal. Early European traders who came across curare could not even agree on what to call it, mostly because they never saw two batches made quite the same way. Some communities stored their finished poison in short lengths of hollow bamboo, which traders eventually nicknamed tube curare, common across the western stretches of the Amazon, in what we now call Peru, Ecuador, and parts of Brazil. Others stored it in small clay pots or hollowed gourds instead, giving rise to entirely different local names. It was in a very real sense dozens of separate regional traditions, each one distinct, each one perfected independently by people who most likely never met each other, all arriving at a similar deadly solution to the exact same problem feeding a family from a forest canopy that never once made hunting easy. Making curare is slow, deliberate work. Vines are cut, bark is scraped away, and everything is boiled down over open fire for hours, sometimes an entire day, until what remains is a thick, dark syrup almost like tar. And here is something that should truly make you sit up a little. That syrup is not dangerous to swallow at all. A person could drink it and feel nothing more than mild discomfort, because curare only becomes deadly once it slips directly into the bloodstream, which means the real danger during preparation was never the finished poison sitting in its container. It was the smallest cut on a careless hand dipped into that syrup without a moment's thought. Once curare enters an animal's blood, whether through a dart or an arrow, it works by quietly switching off the connection between nerve and muscle, one signal at a time until the body simply stops answering. Breathing slows first, then stops completely all, while the animal's mind, as far as anyone has ever been able to tell, remains entirely aware. It is a strange, almost eerie kind of death, silent both outside the body and within it. And I will admit learning that detail changed the way I think about the word poison altogether. We tend to imagine poison as something violent, something that burns or tears its way through a body. Curare does something closer to the opposite. It simply asks very quietly for everything to stop. Here is a detail I find almost impossible to get out of my head once I first heard it, and I suspect you might feel the same way. That same paralyzing poison capable of stopping a monkey's breath from 30 feet away becomes completely harmless the moment the meat is cooked and eaten. Curare cannot survive digestion. It simply breaks down quietly in the stomach, meaning a family could sit down that same evening and eat the very animal that curare had brought down without the smallest bit of danger. Nature, it turns out, drew a very precise, very deliberate line between what kills through the blood and what nourishes through the mouth, and somehow generations of hunters figured out exactly where that line sat, entirely through trial memory and careful observation, long before anyone had ever written the word chemistry down on paper. Among the Matis and several neighbouring communities, hunters refined this system even further, using something almost unsettling in its cleverness. The very tip of each dart would be lightly scored with piranha teeth, cutting a small deliberate weakness right where the poisoned head met the shaft. If a struck animal panicked and tried to pull the dart free with its own hands, the shaft would simply snap off first, leaving the poison tip buried exactly where it needed to stay. There would be no shaking it loose, no clever escape. The poison always had the final word. When a hunter finally climbs back down out of that canopy, whatever he carries rarely stays in one household for long. In many rainforest communities, meat brought home from a hunt gets shared out, across an entire extended family, sometimes an entire small village following unspoken rules about who receives which portion that everyone simply understands without needing it explained. A skilled hunter earns respect this way, not by keeping the best cuts for himself, but by consistently providing for people who are not his own children, his own parents, his own household at all. It is a quiet kind of generosity repeated so often across so many generations that it stopped looking like generosity a long time ago and simply became the way things are done. I want to pause here for a moment because I think it is worth asking. Plainly, does any of this sound crude or primitive to you? A precise chemical formula, refined over countless generations, tested and adjusted through nothing but careful observation and memory, applied with pinpoint accuracy from an instrument engineered for complete silence. That is not luck. That is applied science built entirely without laboratories, textbooks, or a single written word, and honestly I think it deserves to be called exactly that, Consider what actually had to happen for a working formula to exist at all. Someone at some point generations before any of this was written down anywhere had to notice that a particular vine out of thousands of plants growing in that same stretch of forest produced an effect worth remembering. Someone had to test it likely at real personal risk, adjust the boiling time, try mixing it with a second plant, and then somehow pass that exact combination down, accurately enough that it still worked the same way 5, 10, 20 generations later. There was no notebook to check against, no formula written on a wall, just memory repetition and trust between one generation and the next, carrying something this precise across hundreds of years without a single written word to lean on. And here is where this story reaches somewhere I did not expect the first time I researched it. Curare did not stay in the rainforest. As early as the 1500s, an English explorer named Walter Raleigh wrote home describing this strange arrow poison after encountering it along the coast of South America, though it would take well over a century for anyone outside the region to understand what they were actually looking at. By the 1730s, a French scientist named Charles-Marie de la Condamine, travelling deep along the Amazon on a long expedition, finally collected proper samples directly from a community called the Yameos, carrying them back across the ocean, fascinated and more than a little unsettled by what they could do. For centuries afterwards, scientists puzzled over exactly how curare worked, what it was actually doing inside the body to shut it down so precisely, so completely, without ever damaging a single organ along the way. Eventually, that very question led to one of the more remarkable turns in medical history. The active compound inside curare became the foundation for an entirely new category of medicine muscle relaxants, the kind of drugs that allow surgeons today to operate on a patient whose body stays perfectly safely still without the enormous doses of anesthesia that once made major surgery so dangerous. Before that discovery, patients undergoing serious operations sometimes needed to be sedated so deeply just to keep their muscles from moving that the anesthesia itself carried real risk of killing them before the surgery even properly began. A tool refined deep in the Amazon rainforest, built to bring down a monkey from the highest branches without a sound, eventually found its way into operating rooms around the world, quietly protecting patients in a completely different way than anyone who first boiled down that dark, sticky syrup could ever have imagined. I keep coming back to that thought, if I'm being honest with you. Knowledge does not really disappear even when it starts out somewhere the rest of the world has spent centuries underestimating. It simply waits sometimes for hundreds of years for the right person to finally take it seriously. Think about that for a second. Somewhere in an operating room right now on the other side of the world from that rainforest, a surgeon may be relying, without even realizing it, on a discovery that began with hunters testing plants against monkeys in the treetops, generation after generation refining a formula purely through patience and memory. Has anything you have ever passed down in your own family, a recipe, a habit, a small piece of advice ever travelled further than you expected it to? I doubt any of it saved a life in a hospital, but the principle is the same. We rarely know in the moment which small piece of knowledge we are handing forward is going to matter most decades or even centuries from now. There is one more piece of this that I think about often, something about hunting that way high up, patient and completely silent, that seems worth sitting with for a moment before we move along tonight. Because a gunshot or even the sharp crack of a snapping branch sends an entire troop of monkeys scattering in every direction at once, alert and impossible to approach again for hours. A blowgun makes almost no sound at all, which means more than once a patient hunter has been able to take a second animal from the very same troop, sometimes even a third, before the others ever understood what was happening around them. There is something both remarkable and quietly sobering in that, a reminder that the gentlest, quietest approach is often the one nature never sees coming, and a small lesson too for anyone who assumes that getting results always requires being loud about it. If patience in the rainforest can be measured out in a single drop of syrup on the tip of a dart, there is another kind of patience waiting for us just ahead, one built on an entirely different kind of trust. Not between a hunter and a poison this time, but between a person and a bird trained over years to dive beneath the surface of a river and bring back something neither of them could ever catch alone. Picture a river at first light still wrapped in a thin layer of mist that has not yet decided whether to lift. A handful of bamboo rafts drift near the bank, low and narrow, each one carrying a fisherman, and perched along the edge of his raft several dark, sleek birds with hooked beaks and sharp, watchful eyes. Somewhere behind them limestone hills rise straight up out of the water, soft grey shapes still half hidden in the fog, the kind of scenery that looks almost too deliberate to be real, as though someone painted it, rather than let it simply happen. The fisherman leans forward, taps the water once with the end of his pole, and one of the birds slips off the raft without a sound, vanishing beneath the surface. There is something oddly touching about how ordinary this moment feels to the people living it, even though if you stop and actually think about what is happening, it borders on remarkable. A wild animal capable of flying anywhere it pleases at any moment chooses instead to dive into cold water on command hunt with total focus and return to a person waiting patiently on a narrow wooden raft. No leash holds it there, no cage keeps it from simply flying away toward the hills and never coming back. This particular kind of trust took centuries to build, and it does not involve a poison or a spear or even a net. It involves teaching a wild animal to hunt for you, then trusting it enough to bring back what it catches instead of eating it alone. We are on the Li River now in the southern part of China near a city called Guilin, where limestone hills rise up out of the water like something out of a dream you only half remember the next morning. For longer than anyone can properly trace fishermen along this river have worked alongside cormorants, waterbirds built almost perfectly for diving with dense feathers, strong webbed feet, and an appetite that made them worth taming in the first place. There is a small strange detail about cormorants that fishermen figured out and put to good use long before any scientist explained why it happened. Unlike ducks or geese, a cormorant's feathers are not fully waterproof. Most waterbirds rely on natural oils to shed water, instantly staying light and buoyant on the surface. Cormorants instead let a bit of water soak into their feathers, which sounds like a design flaw, until you realize what it actually does. It makes them heavier, less buoyant, and far better at diving deep and chasing fish underwater than a bird that keeps bobbing back to the surface like a cork. That is also why you will often see a cormorant perched afterward with its wings spread wide, holding perfectly still, patiently drying out in the sun. Nature rarely hands out a gift without attaching a small price to it, and here the price was simply a bit of extra time spent drying off after every dive. Here is where the story gets a little more complicated than most people expect, and honestly, I find that complication rather charming. The earliest written record anyone has found describing this kind of fishing does not actually come from China at all. It appears in an official history book from the Sui dynasty completed in the year 636, and in that book the practice being described is happening in Japan, not China. Historians still go back and forth over what that actually means. Perhaps the idea travelled from one country to the other, through envoys and traders moving between the two imperial courts. Or perhaps, and I find this option rather satisfying, two separate groups of people living on two separate coastlines looked at the exact same clever hungry bird and arrived at the exact same idea completely on their own, Either way, by the time cormorant fishing reached its height along the Lee River, the method had been refined into something remarkably precise. A fisherman raises his birds from the moment they hatch, sometimes letting a young bird learn simply by watching older, already trained cormorants dive and return, sometimes using small, gentle rewards to build the habit one step at a time. In the earliest months, a young cormorant is often kept tethered by a light cord, while it learns unable yet to be trusted on open water, watching and imitating the older, steadier birds around it, until diving and returning becomes something closer to instinct than instruction. Before a day of fishing begins, he ties a soft cord or ring loosely around the base of the bird's throat, snug enough to stop it from swallowing anything larger than a certain size, but loose enough that smaller fish can still slip down comfortably. It sounds almost unkind if you only hear it described that way, but consider what it actually accomplishes. The cormorant still gets fed. It simply cannot eat everything it catches before its owner has the chance to see what came up. Have you ever worked alongside someone, a co-worker, a sibling, a friend, where the whole arrangement only worked because you trusted each other completely? That is essentially what a fisherman and his cormorant have, except one half of that partnership cannot speak a single word, and somehow it still works. When a cormorant surfaces with a fish too large to swallow past that gentle ring, the fisherman draws the bird back in often by a long cord, or simply by calling it toward the raft, and reaches into its throat to remove the catch himself. The bird does not fight this. It has done this exact routine hundreds, sometimes thousands of times, and it understands in whatever way a bird understands anything that a smaller reward fish is coming its way once the work is done. A single, well-trained cormorant, according to fishermen who have spent entire lifetimes working this river, can bring in roughly as many fish in a single outing as 3 skilled human fishermen working with nets, which is a fairly remarkable thing to say about an animal that receives no wages and asks for nothing more than fish and a place to perch. I want to sit with something for a moment because it changed how I think about this whole practice once I learned it. Many fishermen along the Lee River do not think of their birds as simple tools the way you or I might think of a fishing rod leaning in a closet. There is a phrase some of them use for their cormorants that roughly translates to something like a child devoted to supporting the household, the same warm, respectful phrase you might once have used for a grown son who cares for aging parents. A cormorant can work alongside the same fisherman for many years, long enough for a real relationship to form, long enough that losing one when it finally happens apparently stings in a way that surprises people who assume this is nothing more than a business arrangement between a person and a bird. Think about your own family for a second if you have a pet who's been with you through more than one hard year. There is a particular kind of loyalty that only builds slowly through routine, through showing up for each other in small, unremarkable ways day after day, season after season. A fisherman does not simply own his cormorant. He raised it from the moment it was small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands, fed it, taught it, trusted it, with his own family's next meal over and over for years at a stretch. Call that whatever word feels most comfortable to you: partnership, friendship, something in between. I am not sure the exact label matters nearly as much as the fact that it clearly, plainly exists. There is a quieter thread running underneath all of this too, one worth mentioning gently. Across much of East Asia, where certain Buddhist teachings discourage the taking of a life directly cormorant fishing, offered something almost like a loophole, though I suspect that word makes it sound more calculated than it truly was. The bird does the diving, the bird does the catching, the fisherman simply receives what is offered to him. Whether or not that distinction eased anyone's conscience, it certainly shaped how the practice was understood by the people who relied on it, less like hunting and more like a kind of harvest gathered with the help of a partner instead of taken by force. Among the very last fishermen still practicing this trade along the Lee River today, there is a man known locally by the nickname Blackbeard, who began learning the craft from his own father at the age of 13, long before he ever considered it a profession rather than simply the way his family always got its dinner. Stories like his are becoming rare now. Most fishermen in that same stretch of river only paddle out these days when they know from decades of reading the water that a real catch is likely sometimes just 3 or 4 times in an entire month. Sometimes not at all, because the fish that once filled this river in great numbers have grown scarcer with every passing decade. Now, China was never the only place this idea took hold, and this is where the story widens out in a way I did not expect the first time I looked into it properly. Across the sea in Japan, a similar tradition called ukai developed along several rivers. Most famously, there's Nagara River near a city called Gifu. Fishermen there work at night as well, their boats lit by hanging lanterns that cast a warm, flickering glow across the dark water, drawing curious fish up toward the light, where the birds can reach them more easily. Records there stretch back remarkably far. Fishermen along the Nagara have documented their family lineage connected to this exact craft for well over 1,000 years, and for a long stretch of that history, only the cormorant fishermen working in Gifu and a neighbouring town called Siki were given the honour of fishing directly for the emperor's own household, earning them the formal title of imperial fishermen. Picture explaining that job title at a dinner party today. I imagine it would stop the conversation rather quickly, and it does not end there. Long before airplanes or telegraphs made the world feel small, European nobility somehow learned of this practice as well. Reports and travellers' accounts describe kings in both France and England keeping their own trained cormorants purely for the pleasure of watching them hunt, and England reportedly went so far as to appoint an official position, a master of cormorants whose entire job was caring for the crown's birds. That particular fashion faded within a couple of centuries long before it ever became a true working tradition the way it remained in Asia, but I still find it worth a small smile imagining some very serious nobleman introducing himself at court as the master of cormorants and somehow keeping a straight face while doing it. Even further from China, along the cold high-altitude waters of Lake Titicaca, some researchers have pointed to evidence that the Uru people of what is now Peru may have been fishing this exact same way even earlier than either China or Japan, possibly by several centuries. The dating on that particular claim is still debated, and I would rather be honest about that uncertainty than pretend the timeline is settled just to make the story feel tidier. What truly matters here, in my opinion, is not who technically did it first. It is that separate groups of people scattered across entirely different continents, who almost certainly never once crossed paths, looked at the exact same hungry diving bird and arrived at astonishingly similar solutions. That is not coincidence stacked on top of coincidence. That is what happens when human curiosity meets a remarkably good idea sitting right there in nature, waiting patiently to be noticed. If you picture cormorant fishing today mostly as a tourist attraction, strings of lantern light reflecting off a river while visitors snap photographs from a passing boat, you would not be entirely wrong, and that does make me a little sad to say out loud. Much of what survives now really has shifted toward performance, kept alive more by curious travellers than by any real economic need, sometimes adding as much as 20 or 30,000 yuan a year to a village's income money that keeps a dying skill breathing a little longer, even as fewer young people choose to learn it themselves. Would you want to spend your whole childhood learning a trade starting at just 13 years old, the way Blackbeard once did, knowing it might not even exist by the time you had children of your own to teach it to? It is not an easy question, and I do not think there is a comfortable answer waiting on the other side of it. But underneath that modern version sits over 1,000 years of something that once mattered enormously. Real families fed, real winters survived, built on nothing more than patience, careful breeding, and a genuine bond between one person and one remarkably clever bird. The show you might catch today is a kind of memorial to that, whether the people watching realize it or not. If trust between a person and a bird can fill an entire basket with fish by the time the sun goes down, I want you to hold on to that feeling for just a moment longer, because we are about to travel somewhere. The water turns from a calm, misty river into open, endless ocean. The partnership waiting for us there looks nothing like a fisherman and his cormorant patiently raised from a hatchling and rewarded with small fish for good behaviour. This next creature was never tamed, never raised by hand, never given a name or a place to perch each evening. It comes up from the deep water because it is asked to by voice, by rhythm, and by a kind of trust between person and animal that sounds almost impossible until you hear exactly how it is done out on open water, where the animal being called is not small, is not gentle, and could without much effort at all decide not to listen. In the year 1642, a Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman was sailing through unfamiliar waters near what is now Papua New Guinea, when he noticed something strange trailing behind a group of local canoes. He wrote it down carefully in his ship's log, describing small half-coconut shells tied together in a chain dragged and rattled along the surface of the water. From the deck of his own ship it must have looked like nothing more than an odd fishing habit, a curiosity worth a single line in a captain's journal, before his ship carried him onward toward the next unfamiliar coastline. He had no real way of knowing at the time that he had just become one of the first outsiders in recorded history to witness something people in that region had likely been doing for generations, already a ritual so specific, so dangerous, and so quietly remarkable that even now, well over 380 years later, most of the world has never heard of it. It is called shark calling, and yes, that name means exactly what it sounds like. Along the western coast of an island called New Ireland, in villages with names like Messikono and Kontu men have spent entire lifetimes learning how to paddle out into open ocean alone in a narrow wooden canoe and deliberately call a shark toward them. Not chase it. Not trap it with a net or a baited long line the way commercial fishing does today. Call it the way you might call a familiar dog in from a yard, using nothing more than sound rhythm and a belief system that treats the ocean's most feared predator as something closer to family than to danger. Would you get into a small wooden canoe paddle miles from shore completely on your own and try to summon a shark toward you on purpose? I will be honest with you, just typing that sentence made my palms feel a little warm. Picture the moment properly for a second, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Land has long since disappeared behind him. The canoe rises and falls gently with each swell alone against an expanse of blue that stretches in every direction without a single other boat in sight. There is no motor humming beneath him, no radio crackling with the voices of other fishermen nearby, nothing at all but the sound of water against wood and his own breath, and eventually his own voice. Most of us go to great lengths without even realizing it to never feel quite that alone, and here is a young man paddling directly toward it on purpose, because his entire community has agreed that this particular kind of solitude is exactly where a person proves who they are. Here is the belief sitting underneath all of this, and I think it deserves to be told plainly, rather than treated as some quaint local myth, because it clearly shapes everything about how this practice works. Many communities along this coast believe that sharks carry the spirits of ancestors within them. A shark in this worldview is not simply an animal moving through the water. It might be a grandfather, a great-uncle, someone from a family line stretching back further than anyone alive can properly count. Approaching a shark, then, is not really an act of hunting in the way we've talked about hunting throughout this whole story so far. It is closer to an act of communication, a conversation held with someone who came before you, conducted in the only language the sea actually understands. Before a young man is ever allowed to attempt shark calling for the first time, he goes through a period of purity and preparation guided closely by the older, experienced callers in his community. Certain foods are avoided in the days beforehand. Certain behaviors, certain kinds of conflict or carelessness are set aside entirely because the belief holds that an unclean or distracted mind will be sensed immediately, and the ancestors simply will not answer a call that does not come from a place of genuine respect. This is not treated casually. It functions as a genuine rite of passage, the kind of moment that marks the difference between being a boy and being counted as a man within that community, and it carries weight that most of us simply do not have an equivalent for in modern life. Can you think of a single moment in your own life that everyone around you agreed without question marked you as fully grown? For many of us, adulthood arrives quietly, almost by accident, a birthday that felt no different from the one before it. Here it arrives on the open ocean alone, facing something with teeth. Once a caller paddles far enough out, the real skill begins. He carries with him a rattle known as a larung, made from halved coconut shells strung together along a length of rattan, and he lowers it into the water beside his canoe, shaking it gently at first, then with more intention sending a specific practiced rhythm down into the deep. At the same time, he sings softly, calling out the names of ancestors, inviting them essentially to come closer. This is not random noise meant to simply attract any curious fish nearby. Each caller develops his own particular rhythm over years of practice, almost like a personal signature carried entirely in sound, and it is that exact combination of song and rattle that is believed to draw a shark up from deeper water toward the surface. Outsiders who have studied this practice from a more scientific angle tend to offer a different explanation for why it actually works, one rooted less in ancestry and more in biology. Sharks possess an extraordinarily sensitive system for detecting vibration and movement in water, capable of picking up the faint irregular pulse of a struggling fish from a remarkable distance away. A rattle shaken with the right rhythm, some researchers suggest, may simply mimic that exact signature, closely enough to draw a curious predator toward the source. I find both explanations worth holding on to at the same time, rather than picking one and dismissing the other outright. The men who have practiced this for generations understand something true about how it works, whether the language they use to describe that truth involves ancestors or nerve endings. Results, after all, have never required agreement about the reason behind them. When a shark does finally approach, the caller does not strike immediately. Instead, he offers something to build the animal's confidence, sometimes a fish tied to a short stick, letting the shark circle, investigate, and grow comfortable with the presence of the canoe above it. This part alone can stretch on for what must feel like an eternity. Minutes ticking past with a living predator circling an arm's length from a wooden hull, thinner than most kitchen doors, and the caller doing absolutely nothing except continuing to sing. Only once the shark commits opening its mouth around the offered bait does the true moment of the whole ritual arrive. The caller slips a carefully prepared noose woven from plant fibre over the animal's head, positioned to catch against its fins rather than its throat, and pulls it snug in one clean motion. A knot built specifically for this purpose only tightens further the harder the shark struggles against it, which, if you think about it for a moment, is a rather elegant piece of engineering built entirely from rope and understanding no metal, no machinery, just an extremely precise knowledge of exactly how a knot behaves under real panicked tension. Attached to that same line is often a carved wooden float, sometimes shaped almost like a small propeller, whose entire purpose is to keep the exhausted shark from diving too deep once the fight begins. The shark pulls. The float resists dragging against the water, tiring the animal far faster than a single man paddling a canoe ever could on his own. Eventually worn down, the shark is drawn near enough to the canoe to be lifted and finally brought under control by hand. Let's be clear about exactly what this means, because I think it deserves to be said plainly. This is without question one of the only places left on our entire Earth where people still catch large, truly dangerous sharks, essentially by hand using no modern line, no steel hook, no net woven from synthetic fibre, nothing pulled from a hardware store or a fishing supply catalogue. Everything from the rattle, to the rope to the float, comes directly from the surrounding forest and reef. And it works not occasionally, not as some lucky exception, but as a skill refined and passed down carefully across an unknown number of generations, tested against one of the most efficient predators the ocean has ever produced. A documentary filmed back in 1982 followed this exact tradition in the village of Kontu, and it introduced the wider world to an elder shark caller named Selim Karasimbe, a man widely respected within his own community for a lifetime spent practicing and passing along this craft. Watching him work the water in that old footage, unhurried, completely certain of himself, in a situation that would leave most of us frozen with fear, tells you almost everything you need to know about what decades of practice can do to a person's relationship with genuine danger. He has since passed away, but the footage of him working the water that day still exists, a quiet, permanent record of a skill that very few people on this earth have ever fully mastered, and even fewer outsiders have ever properly witnessed. Children in that same village today still grow up watching men like him, learning by observation, long before they are ever old enough to hold the rattle themselves, the exact same way skills have always travelled forward in every single tradition we have walked through together so far on this journey. Now I want to share something a little less comforting, because this story does not deserve a version of itself with all the hard parts quietly edited out. Shark calling is not thriving right now. It is holding on. Populations of sharks along this coastline have thinned considerably over recent decades, partly from wider commercial fishing pressure further out at sea, and more recently from a mining venture proposed not far offshore in the Bismarck Sea, a project that intended to extract copper, gold, silver and zinc directly from the ocean floor using equipment lowered down through more than a mile of open water. Local communities along this coast raise serious concerns about what that kind of disturbance so near their waters might mean for the very creatures their callers have relied on for longer than anyone can properly date, and whether the vibration and disruption sent through the water might already be pushing sharks further from the coastline than they have ever travelled before. At an annual shark calling festival held to keep this tradition visible and alive, canoes have in recent years occasionally returned to shore carrying nothing at all. And by several accounts, people gathered on the beach waiting for them have simply wept at the sight of it, not from anger but from something closer to grief, watching a piece of their own history come back empty-handed. I keep sitting with that image longer than I probably should, a beach full of people watching the horizon, hoping to see canoes returning heavy with proof that something ancient still works the way it always has. Every method we have talked about together on this journey so far shares that same quiet thread underneath it. Does it not a community's entire way of understanding itself, wrapped up in whether or not the old skills still hold, What strikes me most about this particular tradition, more than any spear, any harpoon, any trained bird we have covered together up to this point, is that it relies on almost nothing physical at all. No blade, no trap sprung by careful engineering, just a voice, a rhythm repeated with total confidence, and a belief steady enough to carry a person alone into open water beside an animal most of the world spends its whole life being taught to fear. That takes a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with trust. Trust in a story passed down through countless generations. Trust that the ocean approached the right way with the right respect will answer back rather than simply take. I think that is the part of this story I keep circling back to more than any single other detail. Every single method we have explored together so far on this journey has asked something specific of the person practicing it. Patience beside a frozen breathing hole, precision high, in a rainforest canopy, decades spent earning a wild bird's trust. Shark calling asks for something quieter than all of that and somehow harder. It asks a person to walk directly toward the thing an entire species has spent its history learning to run from, and to do it calmly without armor, without a weapon, carrying nothing but a song passed down from people who are no longer alive to sing it themselves. If calling something enormous up from beneath the surface of the ocean using nothing but your own voice sounds almost impossible to picture, wait until you meet the hunters of a very different landscape. Entirely dry, sunburned and stretching out flat in every direction for as far as the eye can follow. There an entirely different kind of tool was perfected, one that seems to break the basic rules of throwing itself curving back through the air toward the very hand that released it, as though it never really wanted to leave in the first place. If someone handed you a boomerang right now and asked you to throw it, there is a fair chance you would expect it to sail out, curve gracefully through the air, and land right back in your open hand a few seconds later, the way it always seems to work in cartoons and tourist shop souvenirs. I need to tell you something that might really surprise you tonight. Most boomerangs historically, the ones actually responsible for putting food on the table, were never designed to come back at all. They were built to fly straight, hit hard, and drop whatever they struck exactly where it stood. If your childhood memory of a boomerang involves a plastic toy from a birthday party, gently curving back toward a disappointed 8-year-old who threw it too hard into a fence, I'm sorry to say that memory has almost nothing to do with the real history we're about to walk through together. We've arrived now on the driest inhabited continent on this earth, a place where Aboriginal peoples have lived continuously for a length of time that is truly difficult to hold in your head all at once. Most archaeologists place the arrival of the first people in Australia at somewhere around 65,000 years ago, which makes this the oldest continuously practiced culture recognized anywhere in the world. Older than agriculture, older than writing, older than most of the landscapes we have visited together so far in this very story. Try picturing that stretch of time for a second. If every single one of those years were a single page in a book, you would need a shelf, not a single volume just to hold it all. To put that number beside something a little more familiar, the entire recorded history of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the pharaohs, every single dynasty most of us learned about in school, fits comfortably inside roughly the last 5,000 years. What we're talking about here stretches back 13 times further than that. An unbroken thread of knowledge, language and skill passed from one generation directly to the next, across a length of time so vast that most of human history as we usually picture it would fit inside it more than a dozen times over with plenty of room left to spare. Here is where that returning boomerang misconception really falls apart. The heavy straight flying versions, sometimes called throw sticks or kylies, Depending on which of Australia's roughly 250 distinct Aboriginal language groups you happen to be asking could weigh somewhere near 4 pounds and fly true for over 300 feet, more than the length of a football field. Thrown properly at that kind of weight and speed, a single strike could seriously injure or outright kill an animal as large as a kangaroo. That is not a toy. That is a real, properly serious hunting weapon refined over an almost unimaginable stretch of generations, and it never once needed to curve back toward the thrower to prove how effective it was. Would you have guessed that the boomerang you've probably seen tossed around a beach or a park was historically speaking closer to a novelty item than to the real working version of the tool? I certainly had it backward for most of my own life, and I suspect I am far from the only one. So where does the returning version actually fit into all of this? Because it is real, and it is clever, just not in the way most of us assume. Lighter, thinner, more carefully balanced. Returning boomerangs did exist across Aboriginal Australia, but their most common practical use had almost nothing to do with striking prey directly. Hunters would throw one of these lighter boomerangs over a stretch of reeds or low brush, where birds were resting, timing the throw, so the tool's shape and motion through the air resembled a hawk swooping down toward its own prey. Startled, an entire flock might take off in a panic all at once, flying directly into nets that other hunters had quietly stretched out and waited beside. Picture the whole scene properly for a second. A group of hunters positions long fine nets between two stands of trees at the edge of a wetland, low to the ground, nearly invisible against the reeds. Somewhere off to the side, another hunter waits, timing his throw, carefully watching the flock settle into a false sense of safety before releasing the returning boomerang directly over their heads. In that single, startled instant, hundreds of birds might lift off at once, driven purely by fear straight into the waiting net, and the boomerang itself, its actual job finished the moment it triggered that panic, simply curves back through the air toward the very hand that sent it out ready to be thrown again for the next flock further down the wetland. The boomerang itself rarely touched a single bird. It worked instead by exploiting fear, borrowing the exact silhouette of a predator the birds already knew to run from, and turning that instinct into a trap. I find something almost playful about that particular piece of engineering. It is not brute force. It is closer to theatre, a costume worn by a piece of curved wood, convincing enough to fool a bird's instincts for just long enough to matter. Have you ever noticed how a fake spider or a realistic-looking owl decoy can still make people flinch, even once they consciously know it is not real? That same principle, borrowing fear rather than confronting an animal directly, was already being applied out here on this continent long before anyone had a word for psychology. Across roughly 250 separate Aboriginal language groups, with well over 800 additional dialects layered on top of that boomerang design, varied enormously depending on region available timber and the specific animals being hunted. Communities living further inland, working across open desert country, tended to favour heavier, straighter throw sticks built for larger game moving across flat exposed terrain. Coastal and high country groups working in denser vegetation often built lighter versions, instead easier to carry, easier to control at closer range. None of this came from one single unified boomerang tradition being copied and passed hand to hand across the continent. It arose again and again, independently refined separately by hundreds of distinct communities, who each solved the same basic problem: how to strike something from a distance in whatever way their particular corner of this enormous continent actually demanded. I think that detail alone deserves a moment of its own because it quietly corrects something the rest of the world still gets wrong fairly often. It is tempting from the outside to speak of Aboriginal Australia as though it were one single culture, one single language, one single tradition stretched across an entire continent. The truth sitting underneath that assumption is something closer to Europe before its modern borders existed hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, its own stories, its own carefully engineered version of a tool that happened to share a single English word once outsiders finally arrived and needed something to call it. One of the oldest boomerangs ever physically recovered was found inside a cave in South Australia, and careful dating places it at somewhere near 12,000 years old, already a finished functional tool by the time it was made, not some early rough prototype still being figured out. 12,000 years is already staggering to sit with, and yet that same object represents only a small, comparatively recent slice of a much longer story, one stretching back tens of thousands of years further still, long before that particular piece of wood was ever shaped by anyone's hands. Boomerangs were never the only long-range tool developed here either. Alongside the throw stick, many communities also relied on a device called a woomera, a narrow length of wood fitted with a small hook at one end that cradled the base of a spear. By extending the effective length of a hunter's arm through simple leverage, a woomera could send a spear flying farther and with considerably more force than a bear throw ever could manage on its own. If that idea sounds a little familiar from earlier in our journey together tonight, you are not imagining things. Ice Age hunters on the opposite side of the world once relied on a strikingly similar device built on the exact same basic principle of leverage. What makes the Australian story different is not the underlying idea itself, but simply how long it stayed in active everyday use. In many parts of the world, that same style of tool eventually gave way entirely to the bow and arrow. Here, across the vast majority of this continent, it never really caught on at all. Hunters kept refining the spear and the woomera instead, generation after generation right up through recent memory, choosing to perfect what already worked, rather than replace it simply for the sake of something newer. I think there is something worth sitting with in that particular choice. We tend to assume that newer automatically means better, that every culture marches forward along the exact same technological staircase toward the exact same destination. Aboriginal Australia quietly proves that assumption wrong. An entire continent encountered that same weapon, or some version of it at various points through trade and contact, over thousands of years, and largely chose to keep walking its own separate path, instead refining spear and woomera and boomerang into something that worked precisely for their own landscape, their own animals, and their own way of living, rather than following whatever direction the rest of the world happened to be heading. There is one more piece of this story that stretches far beyond any single weapon, and I think it might be the most remarkable part of all. Across enormous stretches of this continent, Aboriginal communities practice something researchers now often call fire stick farming, a careful, deliberate pattern of controlled burning applied to the landscape itself, not to destroy it, but to manage it with extraordinary precision. Small low-intensity fires set at specific times of year would clear out old, dry undergrowth before it had the chance to fuel a truly catastrophic wildfire later on. Fresh green growth would spring up in the weeks that followed, drawing kangaroos and other grazing animals toward those newly cleared patches, which made hunting there considerably more predictable. Think about the sheer knowledge this actually demanded. A person setting one of these fires needed to understand exactly how dry the surrounding grass was that particular week, exactly which direction the fire would likely travel, exactly how far it would burn before running out of fuel on its own, and exactly how long it would take before new growth appeared, afterward drawing game back to that same patch of ground. Get any single piece of that equation wrong, and instead of a small controlled patch of new growth, you have an uncontrolled fire racing across country that your entire community depends on. This was not guesswork passed down through luck. It was a genuine tested body of ecological knowledge, refined and corrected across an almost unthinkable number of individual fires season after season for tens of thousands of years in a row. In effect, entire regions of a continent were being gently, continuously reshaped, not through fences or farms in any way we would recognize today, but through fire itself applied with a depth of ecological understanding that took outside researchers a very long time to properly appreciate. For much of the last 2 centuries, newcomers to this continent looked at that same landscape and assumed it had simply always looked that way, untouched, wild, shaped by nothing but chance and weather. It took a remarkably long time for anyone outside these communities to recognize that the open grasslands, the particular mix of trees, the very shape of the country people were admiring, had actually been quietly, deliberately cultivated for tens of thousands of years by people who understood their environment more intimately than almost any outsider ever properly gave them credit for. Picture that scale of thinking for a moment. This was never a single tool aimed at a single animal. This was landscape-level planning practiced consistently across an entire continent for tens of thousands of years by people working with nothing more than fire patience and a depth of observation passed down across more generations than any of us could ever properly count on our own. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground together tonight and really across this entire journey so far. A spear shaped by careful hands beside a quiet lake. A hunter running an animal to exhaustion under a punishing sun. A harpoon built to hold fast in freezing water. A single drop of syrup precise enough to still an animal's breath without a sound. A bird trusted enough to bring home more than it could ever eat alone. A voice calling something enormous up from the deep. And now a curved piece of wood and a landscape reshaped gently by fire, both born from a depth of patience that stretches back 65,000 years and further still. If a boomerang teaches us that the cleverest tool is not always the one that seems most obvious at first glance, and fire stick farming teaches us that patience can be measured across not just seasons, but entire centuries, there is one final place left for us to visit together tonight, somewhere we can finally sit back, catch our breath, and look at everything we have gathered along this long journey side by side, because every single story we have shared from that quiet lakeside spear all the way to this sunburned fire-shaped continent has actually been leading toward the very same handful of truths about who we really are. So here we are at the end of a very long night's walk together, and I want to take a moment before we let it settle for the night, because I think something has been quietly building underneath every single story we have shared tonight, something worth naming out loud before we let it rest. It is easy moving quickly from one place to another, the way we have tonight, ice to desert, to rainforest, to open ocean, to treat each stop along the way as its own separate, disconnected fact interesting on its own, then quickly forgotten once the next one arrives. I do not want tonight to end that way. I think these stories were always meant to be held together side by side rather than scattered apart. Let's walk back through it together just once, gently, the way you might flip through old photographs before finally turning off the lamp. It began beside a quiet lake in what we now call Germany, where hands far older than written history shaped a spear so carefully that it survived hidden in wet clay for longer than our entire species has properly existed, a discovery that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew about who was capable of planning, teaching, and caring for the people beside them. From there we crossed into a punishing desert heat, where a small group of hunters proved that a human body given enough patience could outlast an animal built for speed simply by refusing to stop. We stood in an Ice Age forest as someone lifted a wooden lever to their shoulder, discovering that a little bit of leverage could turn an ordinary throw into something far more dangerous. We watched an entire community dressed as wolves guide a herd of bison toward a cliff their ancestors had used for thousands of years before them. We traced the quiet invention of the bow and arrow, a single string that eventually reshaped how nearly every hunting culture on this earth approached distance and danger. We knelt beside a river in ancient Ireland, studying a woven trap built to feed a family without a single person needing to stand there and wait for it. Then the story turned colder. We crouched over a hole in Arctic ice, learning to notice the smallest flutter of a feather. For the one brief second, a seal's own breath would give us away. We climbed into rainforest branches where a single drop of syrup drawn patiently from a chosen vine could still an animal's breath without a sound, and somehow become completely harmless the moment it reached a dinner table. We drifted down a misty river in southern China, watching a bird choose, again and again, to bring its catch home rather than keep it for itself. We paddled far out into open ocean, where a voice and a rhythm alone were considered enough to call something enormous up from the deep. And finally we stood on the oldest continuously inhabited land on this earth, watching a curved piece of wood do its work not through force, but through fear, borrowed carefully from a hawk, while an entire continent was being patiently reshaped by fire, one careful season at a time. 12 completely different landscapes, 12 completely different tools, and underneath every single one of them, if you listen closely enough, the exact same handful of ingredients, repeated over and over across tens of thousands of years on nearly every continent this earth has to offer. Patience first and always. Almost nothing we talked about tonight happened quickly. A hunter waited beside a breathing hole for hours. A shark caller sang alone on open water for as long as it took. A fire stick farmer thought in seasons and decades rather than single afternoons. Most of us exist inside a world engineered to reward speed, faster answers, faster meals, faster everything. And yet the people in every single story tonight succeeded precisely because they refused to be rushed. Observation right alongside it. None of these tools came from a flash of sudden genius. They came from someone watching closely for years, sometimes for generations, noticing exactly when a seal exhales, exactly how a vine can be boiled down safely, exactly which direction a nervous herd of bison will run. That kind of knowledge cannot be downloaded or skimmed. It has to be earned slowly through attention nobody else was willing to give, and community threaded through nearly every single story we shared tonight, whether or not I said the word directly each time. A mother teaching a child how to hold a spear correctly, an entire village gathering to butcher and share a bison or a whale so that no single family carried that abundance alone. A father standing beside his son for years at a breathing hole waiting for the exact right moment to finally hand over the harpoon. None of these traditions survived because one brilliant individual figured it out once and kept the secret to themselves. They survived because knowledge was shared generously, deliberately, generation after generation by people who understood something. We sometimes forget today that a skill kept entirely to yourself quietly dies with you, while a skill given away freely can outlive you by tens of thousands of years. There is a fourth thread running underneath all of this, too quieter than the other three, and maybe the easiest one to miss if you are not really listening for it. Respect and something akin to reciprocity extended toward the very animals and landscapes these people depended on to survive. The Inuit hunter who refused to chase a struck whale, choosing instead to trust the currents and the spirits to bring it home in their own time. The shark caller who treated the ocean's most feared predator as an ancestor rather than a target. The Aboriginal firekeeper who reshaped an entire continent not by taking from it carelessly, but by working alongside its own natural rhythms season after season. Even curare, that quiet, careful poison, drew such a precise line between what harmed and what nourished that it managed to take a life without ever wasting the meal that followed it. Not one of these traditions treated nature as an enemy to be conquered. Every single one of them, in its own way, treated it as a partner worth listening to. Here is the part I keep circling back to, if I am being honest with you, the same thought that pulled me toward this whole story back at the very beginning tonight. That first spear we talked about, the one resting quietly in German clay for longer than we can properly picture, was not simply a weapon. It was proof that someone hundreds of thousands of years before any of us were born already loved the people around them enough to plan ahead on their behalf. Every single story that followed after it, every harpoon, every rattle, every curved piece of wood, was really just another version of that exact same instinct dressed differently, depending on the landscape, the animal, the century, but never actually changing underneath. We tend to imagine progress as something that moves in a single straight line, primitive people, slowly becoming clever people, slowly becoming us. Tonight, I hope, made that picture feel a little less convincing. The people we walked alongside together were never primitive. They were precise. They were patient. They understood their world with the depth most of us, surrounded by conveniences none of them ever had, have quietly lost the habit of developing for ourselves. If anything, I think we are the ones who could still learn something from them rather than the other way around. You may have noticed something else too, sitting quietly underneath more than one of tonight's stories. So many of these traditions are fading. The last cormorant fisherman on a river that once supported hundreds of them. A shark calling festival where the canoes sometimes return empty now. A woman softening a sealskin boot using a stitch. Her own daughter may never learn. It would be easy to treat that as simply sad, and it is a little. But I think there is something else worth noticing in it too, which is that these skills only survive at all because someone somewhere decided they were worth remembering out loud, worth telling to a stranger, worth writing down, before the last person who truly understood them was gone. In a small way, simply sitting here with me tonight, letting these stories settle into your mind before sleep, is its own quiet act of keeping something alive a little longer than it might otherwise have lasted. So here is my gentle question for you, something worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight, rather than something you need to answer out loud right now. Where in your own life could a little more patience, a little more careful observation, a little more willingness to share what you know, rather than keep it to yourself, actually change something for the better? You do not need a rainforest or a frozen sea to practice any of that. Sometimes it is as small as waiting one more quiet moment before reacting to something or teaching someone beside you the long way instead of just doing it yourself because it feels faster. Maybe it looks like sitting with your child a little longer while they struggle through something you could easily finish for them in half the time, the same way that boy stood beside his father for years before ever being handed a harpoon of his own. Maybe it looks like really watching someone you love closely the way a hunter studies the weather, noticing the small signals before they ever turn into something bigger. Maybe it is simply choosing once in a while to slow all the way down in a life that never once asks you to. None of these people we spent tonight with had the option of rushing. What if some of the most meaningful parts of our own days are quietly waiting on the other side of that same choice made willingly instead of by necessity? I think about the people who spend time with me here most nights, and I suspect quite a few of you are listening to this alone in a quiet room, maybe after a day that asked more of you than you had to give. There is something rather fitting about that if you think about it. Nearly every story we told tonight involved a small group of people or sometimes just one person, sitting quietly with the world around them, patient, unhurried, simply present with whatever the moment happened to bring. No one in any of these stories was scrolling through anything else while they waited. No one was distracted by 6 other things competing for their attention at once. They were simply there fully with whatever the night in front of them required. Perhaps that is exactly what this is too, in its own small way, 2 people, you and me, sitting quietly together at the end of a long day, even though we have never actually met. If you made it all the way here with me tonight, truly thank you. This was a long journey, longer than most, and staying present for the whole of it is its own quiet kind of patience, the very same thing we spent this entire story celebrating in people who lived so long before any of us. If you drifted off somewhere along the way instead, in the middle of that frozen breathing hole, or somewhere out on the open ocean with the shark callers, that is perfectly all right too. That was rather the point all along. Before you let your eyes shut completely, if this kind of story gave you something tonight, a little comfort, a little wonder, maybe even a small piece of history you did not know before, I would be grateful if you left a like on your way out and let me know in the comments which part of tonight's journey stayed with you the longest. I look through every single one, and I am always curious which corner of the world reaches people the most. The ice, the desert, the rainforest, or maybe that first quiet spear beside the lake that started this whole night for us. And if you know someone who could use a long quiet story to fall asleep, to as much as you did tonight, sharing this with them cost you nothing and might just give them the same restful night you are about to have. If you have not subscribed yet and you would like more evenings exactly like this one, that small tap helps far more than you probably realize, and it costs you nothing but a moment. I have another journey already waiting for you, a different place, a different people, a different piece of history worth sitting quietly with. The next time you need somewhere gentle to land at the end of your day. For tonight, though, let this be enough. Let your eyes rest. Let the lights around you fade the rest of the way down. Do you remember that small fire we started this whole night beside the one flickering quietly next to that very first spear, the one a mother once shaped carefully in her own 2 hands, while a child watched and learned beside her? I like to think that fire never actually went out. It simply travelled campfire to hearth, to harpoon lamp to lantern light on a misty river, carried forward by hands that never stopped passing it along, all the way down to whatever small light is glowing somewhere near you right this moment. Somewhere out there on the other side of all these stories, someone is always still awake, still teaching, still patient, still passing something forward. And now so are you. Sleep well, I will see you again very soon.